Excellencies from permanent missions, esteemed high-level speakers, and there will be two online, distinguished guests, colleagues and friends. Thank you for being with us here today and online, which bears testimony to your high interest in this conference entitled Empowering Youth, Indigenous Peoples and Small Island States in Promoting Environmental Rights and Climate Justice. A quick information about the structure of this conference. The event will open with the high-level statements from the keynote speaker and other high-level speakers, whom I will introduce to gain time as and when I give them the floor. The opening remarks will be made by the chairman of Geneva Centre, Ambassador retired Ghazi Joma, to whom I will give the floor very shortly. And then following this, the three panels will focus on youth voices, indigenous peoples' contributions, and small island states leading climate justice. Actually, the conference builds on recent legal developments, including, of course, the UN Human Rights Council establishment of a mandate for climate change-related human rights and the adoption of a landmark UN General Assembly resolution calling for an International Court of Justice advisory opinion on state obligations in relation to climate change. Thus, the conference aims to highlight the commitment of youth, indigenous peoples, and small island states in promoting environmental rights and advancing climate justice, despite significant obstacles. Discussions will focus on enhancing access to education, public information, and climate litigation mechanisms, while exploring how to empower marginalized voices in environmental decision-making processes. With this, I give the floor to our chairman for his opening remarks. Chairman, you have the floor.
Thank you. Excellencies from permanent missions, esteemed panelists, dear colleagues and friends, I am both pleased and honored to welcome you on behalf of the Board of Management of the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue and its dedicated staff to this very important and timely conference entitled Empowering Youth, Indigenous People and Small Island States in Promoting Environmental Rights and Climate Justice. As we gather here today, we are acutely aware that the climate crisis poses one of the most pressing challenges to humanity. The alarming degradation of our environment threatens not only the natural world, but also the fundamental rights of countless individuals. Access to clean air, safe water, food security, and the right to a safe and sustainable environment are increasingly at risk. This crisis disproportionately affects vulnerable populations, including youth, indigenous people, and those from small island states. I am particularly pleased that our discussion today will emphasize the crucial role of youth voices and the invaluable knowledge of indigenous communities in addressing these challenges. By drawing upon their insights and experiences, we can develop practical solutions that respect human rights and foster environmental sustainability. The high level of expertise among our panelists will undoubtedly enrich our dialogue and inform our collective efforts moving forward, especially as we prepare for COP29. Allow me to express my gratitude to all of you for joining us today. Your commitment to this cause is invaluable. A few words about the Geneva Centre, founded in 2013 and holding special consultative status with ECOSOC, as we strive a platform for diverse voices and perspectives on critical human rights issues. I am confident that our collaborative efforts will lead to meaningful progress in promoting environmental rights and justice for all. I wish the conference great success in its noble endeavor And now hand the floor back to the moderator, Dr. Palwankar, Executive Director of the Geneva Centre. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chairman. And with that, I now call upon our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Martin Chungong, who is the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. He has over 40 years of experience, including 14 years in the Cameroonian Parliament, and he has dedicated his career to promoting democracy, dialogue, and conflict resolution, which is continuing to do, as you just informed me. His work focuses on strengthening parliamentary engagement in sustainable development and accountability. And on a personal note, he's also a friend of the Geneva Centre. Martin, you have the floor.
Dear Chair of the Board, I can see you, but I know you're there. Thank you for those introductory remarks. Let me use this opportunity to thank my good friend, Umesh, for inviting me to deliver the keynote address at this very topical event in Great Geneva today. I feel really privileged to join you, united in our commitment to environmental rights and climate justice, with youth as a focus, as well as indigenous peoples. Let me start straight away by identifying two key words that I picked up in the title of this conference, and that is empowerment, empowering, and justice. And I think that it is important for us to really delve into the meaning of empowerment here. People may think that we can be token in our approach to empowerment by saying that the youth are represented like in this room. But yes, it is important when you talk about empowerment to talk about representation. But I think it's also important to talk about giving opportunity to the represented to make a difference in decision making. And that is how I understand empowerment. I also understand justice as something that is fair, that is equitable, that reflects the views of society as a whole. And so today, as we meet in this conference here, I would like for us to be reminded of these two key words, which are very important for the discussions. And you will allow me to focus also on an institution that I know very well, and that is Parliament, of which I am what you'd call the prime mover at the international level, being the Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, the global organization of parliaments. I want to focus on parliaments because they have all the powers to make a difference. All the discussions that are taking place at national and international level can only yield fruit if you have the support of parliaments, because at the national level, they are those who make the laws that transform international outcomes into legislative frameworks at the national level. They are the people who allocate budgets for the implementation of the decisions that we take at the international level. They are the people who hold governments accountable for the implementation of commitments such as the Paris Agreement that I believe we will be focusing on today. And of course, they need to be legitimate and representative as the people who are called upon to articulate the interests of all of society. So I think that whatever parliaments do should be seen through this lens of empowerment and justice. As a Secretary General of the Inter-Parliamentary Union, as I said, the global organization of parliaments, I am pleased to say that climate action and human rights are central pillars of our strategy. We indeed have identified climate change as #1 priority for the global parliamentary community, and efforts are being deployed in order to make sure that parliaments are mobilized for climate action. And in this regard, I want to go back to what I said about empowerment. Empowerment meaning representation, but also articulation of the interest of society as a whole. And today we are focusing on youth, indigenous peoples, and small island developing states, those people who are on the front line of the climate crisis. And we think that no action can be legitimate, no action can be successful if voice is not given to these communities. That is, for me, the meaning of inclusiveness. And when I look at the landscape of youth empowerment in the world today from the parliamentary angle, it is far from satisfactory, I must admit, and this is to say the least. Our statistics show that young people under the age of 30 account for 60% of the global population. But how many people do know the percentage of young people in parliament in this age bracket? Do you know? 2.6%, only 2.6%. So you have 60% of the global community being represented by just 2.6% in those institutions that are intended to improve on the lives of the people. This is not satisfactory. So we need to go back to the drawing boards to see how we can encourage more youth representation in governing structures around the world, especially in parliaments. And that's why the Inter-Parliamentary Union has endeavored to promote what we call the More Youth in Parliament campaign, which is intended to mobilize leaders across the world to make sure that youth are adequately represented in Parliament. So to this past week, we have been celebrating the 10th anniversary of the Global Forum of Young Parliamentarians within the IPU. And we have seen over this past 10 years, the impact of youth, their contribution to the solution of global issues. They're full of energy, they're full of new ideas, they are adept at new technologies and all this. And we need to channel this into the mainstream of decision making, which is something that I want to underscore here. Then I think that we need for there to be strong partnerships. When you look at the climate crisis, it is not something that one constituency alone can deliver on. It is something that has to involve a cross-section of stakeholders, parliaments, governments, civil society, all united in a common vision to make sure that this disease, we call it disease, called climate change, is addressed in a very robust fashion. And I'm glad that we have this conference here today that will allow us to share good practices. That is what I saw in the concept note for this event. Share good practice when it comes to confronting climate change, involving youth, involving indigenous communities and small island developing states that are, as I've said, the most vulnerable to climate change. And if you allow me, I would just make a few reflections. One, I've already said that for us, the IPU, climate action is of strategic importance. It is something that we are dedicating the bulk of our efforts to, and we are mobilizing parliaments across the board to live up to the dream, ambitions of the Paris Agreement, which is, I think, the foundational global blueprint for us to work more robustly and effectively in this regard. And that's why last year we launched the Parliament for Planet campaign, which indeed is one that is intended to advocate for climate action at parliamentary level, encourage parliaments, give them tools to make laws, to adopt budgets and hold governments accountable. And we are looking forward to going to Baku later this year for the 29th COP, where we will continue to mobilize parliaments to give voice to all in society, young people and other vulnerable communities. We started the practice in Dubai of bringing together youth leaders and civil society stakeholders in conversation with parliamentarians so that we can forge this coalition that is important for effective climate action. So I don't want to belabor the point about representation of youth in governance structures. I believe that we have been very vocal about this. You cannot be taking decisions on behalf of young people without involving them. And that is why the motto that says no decisions about youth without youth is something that resonates very well with us. And I believe that we can resolve the youth representation issue by looking at what has been done in terms of women's political participation. More robust action in putting in place legislated quotas for young people that has proven its worth, reserved seats for young people, but also programs intended to build their capacity to run for office. We need to be very clear in the legislative reforms that we need to put in place, because in many countries, people are not too young to vote, but they are too young to run for office. People are not too young to drink alcohol, but they're too young to run for office. So one thing that we need to do is to make sure that the age of eligibility for public office is aligned with the voting age. And we see across the world that this is something that is happening to good effect. The next point I want to make is about climate change, which is, as we all know, a fundamental human rights issue. We must address this robustly. Several years ago, I was in the Maldives, and I saw what climate change was doing to whole communities. I think there are lots of islands in the Maldives that are just going under the water. I saw evidence of this when, I was taken to visit an area where the ocean had made, quote unquote, inroads into land, and within the space of 5 years, it had advanced some 10 meters inland. And so it is a real threat. And if we do not address the specific issue of small island developing states for whom this is a priority, then we are disappointing a huge chunk of our population. And how do we do this? We need to bring them into the discussion. We have to make sure that their specific interests are addressed. And at the IPU, the Inter-Parliamentary Union, we are doing this by creating a space within the IPU assemblies for the seats, as we call them, to articulate their views so that they can be taken into the mainstream of IPU decision making. And small things also matter. For instance, last year, we did award the Crema Passi Prize, which is a prize instituted to celebrate the MP of the Year. We did actually award this prize to the Speaker of the Parliament of Tuvalu for his work in mobilizing global action against climate change. His country is about to disappear. It is estimated that within 10 years, Tuvalu will be completely under the sea. So these are little things that we can do, But whatever we do, we need to make sure that those people who are impacted most by the crisis, the climate crisis, are at the table when decisions are being made, are at the table when budgets are being allocated. And I want to argue that the choice forum for doing this is parliaments, because constitutionally they have the powers to make things happen. But they don't work in a vacuum. They work in partnership with other stakeholders. And that is why we promote the concept of parliamentary ecosystems, which views parliaments not just as individual isolated institutions, but an institution, a parliament that is working as part of a galaxy where you have various stakeholders, the executive arms of government, civil society, and other advocacy movements working together to inform decision making. So let me conclude. I think I was asked to speak for 10 minutes, and it's almost, I think it's over now, but I'm leaving on borrowed time, not to eat into your time for discussions, but I just want to say that the climate crisis is so compelling that urgent action is required. We do know what has worked when it comes to climate uh, change. We just need to mobilize the commitment at all levels, political, including with parliaments and executive arms of government, with other stakeholders, so that together we can be united in confronting this disease. We need greater collaboration and action, and it is now that we need this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary General of the IPU, and on a personal note, thank you, Martin, for the very inspiring comments and observations that you made. I just had some takeaways. Of course, all of this will be incorporated in our final outcome report of this whole conference. But I really enjoyed hearing that empowerment and justice and youth representation are crucial issues also for the IPU. And very important, the crucial role of parliaments, because without them, national measures of implementation cannot take place. And as you rightly pointed out, neither budgets. And finally, the great, highly vulnerable small island states, as you said, Tuvalu is going to disappear probably, unfortunately, next 10 years. And that climate change has become really strategic importance, of strategic importance. And also, as later on, Todd from the OHCHR was mentioned, also a fundamental human rights issue. So thank you very much for that. I now give the floor online to the next high-level segment speaker, Mr. Secretary Robert E.A. Borge, Minister, Vice-Chairperson and Executive Director, Climate Change Commission, Philippines. Mr. Borge has served nearly 2 decades in government service, and he serves as the Philippines' national focal point to the UNFCCC and IPCC, leading key negotiations on adaptation, mitigation, and climate finance. In 2023, he became the first Filipino member of the UNFCCC Adaptation Committee. Mr. Borge has also held foreign postings in Washington and New York, and is a recipient of multiple prestigious awards. Please, Minister Borge, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Good afternoon from Manila. Honorable delegates, partners, and advocates, the impacts of climate change are global, systemic, and historic. We have already experienced its severe effects, and we will continue to do so if we all don't act now. In fact, in the Philippines, we are now reeling from the impact of tropical storm Christine. And even as I speak here on climate change, we have people in our provinces who continue to suffer from the impacts of climate change. So it is an honor for me to be here and to speak to you on behalf of the Philippine government. Vulnerable groups such as youth, indigenous peoples, and those living in small island developing states or SIDS face the harshest of consequences, such as climate-induced displacement, loss of livelihoods, and heightened inequalities. Immediate and decisive action is important, as delays, as we all know, will lead to more complex and costly adaptation measures. The Philippines bears witness to the increasing severity of climate impacts. Typhoons, rising sea levels, and droughts all threaten our lives, our livelihood, and our future. Over the past decades, my friends, tropical cyclones alone have cost 673.3 billion pesos, or approximately 12.24 billion US dollars in losses and damages. This is equivalent to the annual earnings of 3 million Filipinos living on minimum wage. This is equivalent to double the Philippine government's education budget for 2023 and is roughly equivalent to 9.6 million hospital beds that potentially could be used by our sick and infirm Filipinos. For our country, therefore, climate justice is not just a cry for help, it is a call for those responsible to take action. Guided by the Paris Agreement's principles of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities, the Philippines advocates for the equal protection and empowerment of these vulnerable groups. Our policies are grounded on the need to strengthen adaptive capacities across all sectors, particularly for marginalized communities. We affirm that adaptation must follow a country driven, participatory, and gender responsive approach. This approach should integrate traditional knowledge, indigenous peoples' wisdom, and the best available science. The voices of those most affected must guide decision making and ensure their active participation in shaping adaptation and resilience strategies. The Philippines anchors its policies and plans on the 1987 Constitution, which upholds fundamental human rights such as the right to life and the right to live with dignity, free from fear of reprisal. These rights are intertwined with the principles of social accountability imbued in the interest of climate change and human rights obligations. This includes the protection of human rights and vulnerable groups, including the youth, IPs, and the poorest of the poor. The Climate Change Act of 2009 established the Climate Change Commission as the lead policymaking body that mainstreams climate change in all levels of government planning. At the heart of CCC's mandate is the protection of vulnerable groups and marginalized communities from the adverse effects of climate change. The Philippines recently completed its National Adaptation Plan, or NAP, 2023 to 2050, which is both a document and a process that aims to steadily reduce climate related loss and damage and build the country's adaptive capacity towards transformative resilience and sustainable economic development by 2050. The NAP highlights the vulnerabilities of the youth, IPs, and people living in small islands. It also underscores the importance of their involvement in cultural heritage preservation, population displacement and migration management, and ecosystems and biodiversity conservation. Their active participation is critical in planning, decision making, and implementing adaptation strategies to manage and conserve ecosystems and protect cultural heritage in the face of climate risks. The Philippines has also developed the Philippine Country Program for the Green Climate Fund from the period 2019 to 2023, which is crucial to implement adaptation and mitigation programs that aim to achieve climate resilience and green growth. One of the nine thematic areas in this program is the integration and active involvement of Indigenous peoples in climate change adaptation and mitigation, disaster risk reduction initiatives, or CCAM-DRR. At the heart of our advocacy is the principle of intergenerational responsibility. This enshrines the duty of the state, our government, to act decisively to preserve the environment, the ecosystems, not just for the present, but for the generations that follow. This compels us to ensure that future generations will inherit a country and a planet where their rights are upheld. As we continue to implement these programs, we emphasize the role of the youth, IPs, and local communities. They are not just victims of the climate crisis, but rather they should be seen as key partners in climate action. I take this opportunity to underscore the importance of democratic principles, values, and institutions that remain strong in the Philippines. The Climate Change Commission of the Philippines works on the principle of inclusivity and engages formal and informal sectors, and these include our National Youth Commission of the Philippines, which works on many issues concerning the youth, and the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. It is really about empowering everyone. In the case of the NCIP, it is also about securing free and prior informed consent for all projects, for all programs that affect our Indigenous peoples. In fact, my friends, the Philippines is currently commemorating Indigenous Peoples Month this October, and we honor our participation today with the Indigenous peoples' contributions to the country and recognizing the need to promote their welfare and cultural rights. Also, empowering the youth is critical and crucial to address the global crisis that is climate change. They are key drivers of innovation and not just future leaders. We think of them as present leaders who may not have the cloak of formal structures, but they are leaders nonetheless. Therefore, they must be given platforms to shape climate solutions. We are here. Our commitment is to equip them with the knowledge, the resources, and the decision making ability and power to ensure a future that reflects their aspirations for a sustainable and just world. Traditional ecological knowledge also offers invaluable insights into resource management, while the energy and innovation of the youth provide new pathways to climate action. Furthermore, the Philippines is an archipelago of small island communities, and despite their diverse challenges, they continue to be at the forefront of the climate crisis. While the Philippines is not classified as a SIDS, our archipelagic structure exposes us to similar climate vulnerabilities. With 60% of our cities located along coastlines, we experience firsthand the risks of rising sea levels, biodiversity loss, and other hazards. Adapting to these changes requires specific or place specific responses, acknowledging the unique biophysical, social, and cultural characteristics of each communities. Therefore, what the Philippines feels and experiences happens also with SIDS, and what SIDS experiences, that also experienced in the Philippines. As such, the Philippines, my friends, calls for a global commitment to empower the most vulnerable. We urge stronger cooperation in operationalizing mechanisms such as the Loss and Damage Fund to prioritize those who are disproportionately affected by climate change. But we would also like to stress the importance of adaptive or preventive adaptation because when things are lost, some are lost forever, never to be recovered again. The Philippine government under President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. reaffirms its commitment to climate action by advancing policies that protect our ecosystems and uplift the vulnerable. In closing, our message is clear. Securing a just, sustainable, and resilient future is only possible if we safeguard the rights of those most affected by climate change. Therefore, we must act now and translate empowerment into action, action that secures our rights and champions climate justice for all. Let us remember, let us not forget. In this quest, we count on the majesty of the law and the strength of treaty obligations and the certainty of a rules based international order that's coupled by common and genuine concern for the welfare of the entire humanity in order to uphold and protect the rights of all, particularly the most vulnerable. Thank you. Maraming salamat.
Thank you very much, Minister Borge, for highlighting the dramatic climate change impacts of your country and elsewhere in the world, and also and especially the links to the human rights, both protection afforded under human rights law and the obligations on states imposed. Thank you again. And let us know when you pass through Geneva so we can meet in person this time.
I certainly look forward to that occasion. We need
Thank
to
you.
protect
Thank
and
you very
uphold
much.
human rights wherever we are.
With pleasure. Thank you. I now, well, I can't say give the floor to Elisa Morgera, the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the context of climate change. Elisa is a professor of global environmental law at the University of Strathclyde in the UK, an expert in human rights and environmental law. She has worked with the UN, advised governments and civil society worldwide. And she also directed for a number of years the One Ocean Hub, a global research initiative on human rights and the ocean. She has published extensively on climate biodiversity, rights of indigenous peoples, and small-scale fishers. Please, the video.
Hi, my name is Elisa Morgera, and I'm the UN Special Rapporteur on Climate Change and Human Rights. I really wish I could be there at the conference on empowering youth, indigenous peoples, and small island states in promoting environmental rights and climate justice. And in fact, I think this conference should be as much, if not more, about empowering everyone else to value, to listen, and learn from and work with youth, indigenous peoples, and large ocean states. This is a matter of human rights, and it's also a matter of creating a human rights cultures in climate negotiations. Since the start of my mandate, I have emphasized how human rights shouldn't be seen as an add-on, as something additional to do on top of our fight against climate change. But it is really how we can take effective, meaningful, inclusive climate action. And that means that we need to kind of move away from the idea that we, states identify climate action and then need to work towards social acceptability of climate measures. In fact, truly respecting human rights and practicing them and listening to youth, indigenous peoples, and their communities in large ocean states means that we need to co-develop those climate solutions with the human rights holders that have been most affected by climate change, not impose them on them. And why is that? Because their lived experiences help climate negotiators with system thinking, with transformative thinking. It is in their lived experiences that all the elements and complexities around climate change and its impacts on human rights, including negative human rights impacts of certain climate solutions, come together. And it's when they come together that we have a clearer sense of what we need to do and how we need to do climate action differently. So this is why we need to engage and listen with human rights holders that have been most affected, and that includes indigenous peoples and youth and the population in large ocean states. And we need to understand their lived experiences as an evidence base for climate decisions to be able to prevent foreseeable negative impacts on human rights, which we might not have expected, which may have challenged our imagination until now. But now that they have been documented and understood, we need to make them a central part of the evidence base of how we make decisions and ensure the states prevent other foreseeable negative impacts on human rights from happening. Of course, with regard to indigenous peoples, we have a long history of understanding and recognizing their human rights, including their human rights to information and to free, prior, informed consent on any activity that may be placed on their territories or have negative impacts on their territories. And unfortunately, this is becoming more and more the case also for certain forms of climate solution, on top of the negative impacts that climate change itself is having on indigenous peoples and their territories. And it is important to realize that while giving a seat at the negotiating table to indigenous peoples representatives is essential, it is not enough to make sure that they have a genuine opportunity to contribute to decision-making. The genuine opportunity also comes from addressing stereotypes and misconceptions about indigenous people's knowledge and their contributions to international decision-making. We have to recognize that the current format of meetings is dominated by certain types of sciences, and this may be inherently stacked against an open and meaningful engage with other knowledge systems, and that indigenous peoples may have other preferred ways to communicate their knowledge, which may not be usually present in those climate negotiating spaces. Often using art and storytelling, which interestingly enough are arising more and more in transformation sciences as important means for also Western knowledge holders to be able to think in more transformative ways. With regards to youth, I think it's really important. We're seeing some opening, but again, having youth, first of all, at the decision-making table rather than on the margins is one essential step. The other is also using youth-led methodologies for their engagement with the process, rather than having them to adapt and maybe not really being able to fully express themselves and their contributions because of the adult driven space in which those climate decisions are made. It's also important to make sure that education for young people is very much based on the findings from human rights and climate change, clarifying what have emerged as false solutions from a human rights perspective, and really empowering youth to be aware of the exercise of their human rights in the context of climate decisions. but equally being aware and being self-reflective about any potential conflict of interest that there may be, particularly at a point in their life where they may be looking for jobs and may be potentially open to corporate capture or business influence. Another point that I think it's really important in terms of youth participation is solidarity with children and support for the protection of children's rights as part of the intergenerational dialogue we need in the context of climate change. I wonder how many of the youth representatives in the conference were aware of the first children dialogue at the Bonn climate intersessional meetings this year, how many were involved, and how many may be interested in supporting that process moving forward. Because of course, today's children will be tomorrow's young people, and there's a really important element of solidarity and mutual support, but particularly support from young people to children who face even harder barriers in their participation in climate decision-making. And on large ocean states, I think there's a legal and moral need to really engage and fully understand with the evidence of more than a decade of massive human rights negative impacts of climate change on their populations, as well as understanding the unimaginable choices that they're facing today to ensure their survival. Physical survival, cultural survival, and many other dimensions of human survival. At the same time, we need climate negotiators to really value and appreciate and learn from ocean culture as part of the best available science to understand the interconnections between the climate system and other planetary systems, and to understand the interdependence between different forms and dimensions of human well-being and a healthy environment, which includes a safe climate, but also a healthy ocean. And fundamentally, in this process of both understanding and valuing the evidence coming from the lived experience of populations in large ocean states, and the importance of ocean culture in, again, transformative thinking around the climate solutions we need, ensuring that the agency of large ocean states, their preferred solutions we can be developed in their context, are then financed by international climate funding available, as opposed to them receiving suggestions and proposals that are coming from donors. Once again, the climate solutions need to be co-developed and led and driven by the lived experiences and contexts of large ocean states. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing how your conversation goes, and remain available to implement some of the recommendations you will be developing.
We all thank Special Rapporteur Elisa Morgera for those very insightful remarks, and once again, hope to meet her in person when she passes through Geneva. I now have the pleasure to hand over the floor to our next high-level speaker, Mrs. Christine Adam, who is the Director and Principal Legal Advisor of the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn. As such, she oversees the provision of substantive and procedural legal services and advice to the UNFCCC process, including the annual Climate Change Conference, COP, which is the biggest annual UN conference. Prior to joining the UNFCCC Secretariat, Christine worked for the International Organization for Migrations in Bern, Helsinki, and finally Geneva, where she was the Deputy Director of the Department of Legal Affairs. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Umesh, and hello, good morning to everybody. Dear distinguished speakers and guests, I would like, of course, first of all, to thank the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancements and Global Dialogue for hosting this event, which is very timely and very important, and thanks a lot for the opportunity to address you all here today. Climate change is more than just an environmental challenge. It represents an existential threat to every assets to the very essence of life on our planet. The signs of this crisis are everywhere, from melting ice caps and rising sea levels to devastating wildfires and increasingly severe storms. And they're happening right now, as we have heard from His Excellency Minister Borche as well. And while these impacts are global, they are felt most acutely by those who are the least responsible for causing them: youth, indigenous people, and small island states. And despite contributing the least to global emissions, these communities are bearing the heaviest burden of climate change and grappling with the harshest consequences. The urgency cannot be overstated. And as the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC has said so often, we are standing at a critical juncture where our actions or lack thereof will determine the future of generations to come. We need immediate, inclusive, and equitable action to confront the devastating impacts of climate change. And to achieve this, we must ensure that the leadership and knowledge of those on the front lines, the indigenous peoples and communities, youth and small island states, who bring invaluable worldviews, values, and experience, are central to policymaking and action in addressing climate change. And this is precisely why the role of the civil society is crucial in fighting climate change and the development of effective climate solutions. The engagement is not just beneficial, it is essential. Their participation brings three key benefits. So firstly, I would like to highlight that it promotes transparency and accountability. Civil society engagement serves as a watchdog for climate governance. They help to hold policymakers accountable and ensure that climate actions are fair, effective, and truly serve those most in need. The inclusion of civil society also strengthens the transparency of the process. Secondly, it amplifies underrepresented voices. Youth injects a sense of urgency and innovation into climate action, advocating for ambitious policies that go beyond mere rhetoric. And the centuries-old knowledge and sustainable practices from indigenous peoples and local communities provide crucial insights into living harmoniously with nature, while their deep understanding of ground realities offers practical solutions often overlooked in high-level discussions. And thirdly, the civil society participation ensures inclusive and effective policies. When those most affected by climate change are actively involved in the development, policies tend to be more comprehensive and just. Their participation helps ensure that solutions are not just top-down directives, but are grounded in diverse experiences and realities of people around the world. The integration of public participation and access to information has become a core element of the UN climate change process that we at the UNFCCC Secretariat facilitate. Over 3,000 non-governmental and international organizations have been granted observer status, allowing them to actively participate in the UN climate change conferences. Today, we can see a dedicated mechanism and platforms designed to foster the active engagement of youth, indigenous people, and other critical stakeholders in vital conversations regarding climate policy making, with respect to adaptation and mitigation strategies, with respect to climate finance, climate justice, and sustainable developments and innovation. And I would like to walk you through some of these key initiatives. So, for example, an important resource is the UNFCCC Capacity Building Portal, which offers extensive tools and knowledge aimed at strengthening the skills of young people in climate science, policy, and advocacy. The portal, alongside various UN partnerships with bodies like the Inter-Parliamentary Union, whose representative is here today as well, and UNEP, has provided young parliamentarians and activists with courses and learning opportunities, empowering the next generation of climate leaders to actively participate in dialogue and decision-making. And equally very groundbreaking, and I think you will hear about it also in one of the later panels today, but very groundbreaking in the UNFCCC process has been the engagement of the indigenous people and local communities and the creation of the Local Communities and Indigenous People Platform, LCIPP by its abbreviation. This has been really a landmark achievement. Through this platform, Indigenous people and local communities have gained a formal voice in high-level climate decision-making. They have formed a facilitative working group, which is unique as the only constituted bodies where both parties and Indigenous people have equal representation and voting powers and select their own co-chairs along parties. The LCIPP has played a crucial role in ensuring that Indigenous knowledge systems are recognized and integrated into global climate strategies, while also supporting capacity building efforts that empower these communities to meaningfully engage in the process. In conclusion, as we look ahead to future UN climate change conference and the ongoing work to implement the Paris Agreement, centering the leadership of youth, Indigenous people, small island states will be absolutely essential. These groups bring innovative solutions and invaluable knowledge to the fight against climate change. The active participation is not just the right thing to do. It is necessary for crafting effective and equitable climate policies. The climate crisis is the defining challenge of our time, and it will take all of us, across generations, cultures, and geographies, all of us needing to work together to solve it. By empowering those on the front lines of climate impacts, we can drive the transformational change needed for a just and sustainable future. I thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Christine, for that comprehensive, informative, and analytical overview. And especially thank you for stressing the existential threat to the very essence of life, as you said, and we had a defining moment of our existence, common existence as humankind. And I also appreciated that you stressed the role of civil society organizations. That's very encouraging and gratifying for us in particular. Thank you again, Christine. I now give the floor to our next high-level segment speaker, to my right, Todd Howland. Todd has over 30 years of experience in human rights, beginning with his work in Rwanda after the 1994 genocide, and he has held key UN roles in Angola, DR Congo, and Colombia, where he participated in the FARC peace negotiations. Currently, he serves as the chief of a very important department of the OHCHR, which is the Development and Economic and Social Rights Branch, DECIP, OHCHR, overseeing various rights, including those of women, minorities, migrants, but not only. Todd, you have the floor.
Excellencies, distinguished experts, panelists, participants, good morning. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to address you at this conference dedicated to the issue of climate justice for youth, Indigenous people, and small island states. I want to thank the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for this important initiative. The interconnected planetary crises are a human rights crisis. They threaten the full enjoyment of human rights by people throughout the world, including the rights to life, water, sanitation, food, health, housing, work, and a healthy environment and development, to mention a few. By advancing human rights, including gender equality, children's rights, youth participation, and the rights of Indigenous people, we can achieve more effective and sustainable climate outcomes for people and the planet. That's why COP29 must hear the voices of those disproportionately affected and have outcomes that value and protect them, recognizing their roles as agents of change. Last month in New York, states negotiated the Pact for the Future and committed to enhance capacity building for children and youth, Indigenous people, and those in vulnerable situations to ensure their meaningful and informed participation in the design and implementation of programs and policies at all levels of governance. We have a lot of work to do. The Declaration on Future Generations also called for states to ensure the right of Indigenous people to participate in decision-making and in matters which would affect their rights and acknowledge the need to address the special challenges faced by small island states as one of the preconditions for future generations to thrive in prosperity. Last month in Geneva, OHCHR presented the UN Secretary General's analytical study on the impact of loss and damage on the full enjoyment of human rights to the Human Rights Council. The study emphasized that the rights of certain groups of people are disproportionately and often intersectionally affected, including those of Indigenous people, youth, and people living in small island states. The Secretary General also called for applying a transitional justice lens to climate change-related loss and damage as a means to advancing truth-seeking, justice, reparation, and non-reoccurrence with the aspiration of systemic transformation. COP29 offers a critical opportunity to advance the integration of human rights in the efforts to finance climate action and achieve a just transition. A human rights economy which aims to center people and rights in economic policymaking should inform this work. A human rights economy embraces the transformative potential of human rights, principles of equality and non-discrimination, and recognizes economic, social, cultural, and other rights as part of the rule of law, not mere aspirations. To address the interconnected planetary crises in an equitable manner, we need inclusive economies, purpose-driven toward equitable and sustainable development. A just transition centered in human rights that ensures that youth, women, children, Indigenous people, and others disproportionately affected by environmental harms are not left behind. As our High Commissioner highlighted at the panel on youth engagement in the Climate Decision-Making HR 54 session, while the impacts of climate change are already being dramatically felt today, it is the young people and future generations who will unfortunately bear the brunt. It is also young people who have stepped forward with commitment and creativity to demand immediate and ambitious action from governments and businesses in the face of this unprecedented crisis for the planet and for human rights. Human rights law can be an effective tool to address the outsized power of business and state actors that resist the needed changes. Small island states are disproportionately affected by climate change. They have played a key role in advocating for rights-based environmental action, including the advancement of the right to a healthy environment. Through the active participation in international negotiations, small island states have pushed for a stronger multilateral agreements and cooperation to address environmental degradation and push for universal recognition of the right to a healthy environment. A great example of this is the leadership and the spearheaded by Vanuatu and supported by SIDS at the UN General Assembly to obtain a resolution requesting the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion clarifying states' obligations under international law to protect the climate. The Paris Agreement framework explicitly references the rights of Indigenous people and emphasizes the important role they often play in protecting the environment and as custodians of Indigenous knowledge. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People recognized the rights of Indigenous people, including their lands, resources, and territories, and to maintain control, development, and to protect their traditional knowledge. Multiple studies have shown that simply respecting and protecting and fulfilling these rights is one of the best things we can do for Indigenous people and for the climate. This is true of our society as a whole. Truly respecting human rights by businesses and investors, by integrating it into economic policymaking, and us as consumers integrating the rights of others into our choices would have a transformative impact on the world, our societies, and our planet. Guaranteeing the full, equal, and meaningful participation of small island states, youth, and Indigenous people as rights holders and leaders in decision-making at all levels is vital to a just and effective climate outcome, integrating the respect for human rights, and leading up to and during COP29 in Baku. Thank you, and I wish you a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Todd, for that very rich statement, which offers valuable inputs into our outcome report, which, as you all know, will also include lessons learned and ways forward recommendations from this conference. So thank you again for that. And I was very glad that when you said climate change threatens the full enjoyment of human rights, because that brought me back to I remember from reading, I was a young kid, but reading the 1968 Tehran Declaration on Human Rights, which said that peace is the precondition for full enjoyment of human rights and war is their negation. But here you have brought, just as Christina said, that's a new challenge, not just war, but climate change, which has become the defining challenge of all times. Thank you again, Todd. With that, I give the floor to our last high-level segment speaker, to my left, next to Martin, Mr. Adel Ramdani, who is the regional focal point for Swiss Youth for Climate, where he advocates for sustainable practices among youth. He has experience in international organizations and focuses on sustainable food production and urban farming, having represented youth at key events such as the Youth for Climate Summit and the EU delegation to the G7. Adel, you have the floor.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I don't know how you keep up with so many speeches that early in the morning. I think it's always hard to get so much information. And I haven't had even my first coffee. It's quite interesting for me when I come to those kind of conversations because we are always in a rush, right? There's 3 more panels after this. Some of us were at the Climate Week a few weeks ago, and there's Baku and Cali, and we're always running towards the next framework, the next strategy, and you start a new strategy before you know it, you have to think about the next one. Right? The UN is talking about a decade of action. And I hope that we haven't waited for this decade for action, that we've done some action before as well. And I want to use this time just as an opportunity to reflect a little bit, because it's so easy to forget where we come from and to forget why we do justice work. Because justice becomes a job, it becomes a 9 to 5. I'm a climate justice activist from 9 to 5, and then I go on the weekend and do something else. And I think we should not forget why we do this and why we have a system that is deeply extractive and deeply oppressive, and what that means for communities. Because my biggest fear is to become one of those activists who comes on those panels and speak, but just forgets what it actually means. What does coloniality mean in those contexts, and how do we unpack, address with methodology the different layers of oppression of the system we live in. So I'd like to start with a small quote from a brother of mine. His name is Bayo Akomolafe, who taught me so much. And he taught me one of those things. He said to me once, "The times are so urgent that we need to slow down." I was like, "What do you mean? We have to run. I mean, we have to move quickly before it's too late, before we break tipping points." He was like, We have to slow down. Because otherwise we overlook people, we overlook communities, right? Otherwise we just think about the energy transition as being carbon driven and as climate change as being just an issue in tech. But then at the end of the day, we have to remember that the system we live in works perfectly well. Like the system we live in was not designed to deal with communities or to deal with indigenous-led funds or women-led organizations like mine. It was a system, and it's still a system based out of extraction and exploitation. It's a system that takes away from nature and who does not restore. So whatever we have to do has to be systemic. And we have to challenge with honesty and honest courage those dynamics. So let me, now that we have established this beautiful picture, let me tell you a bit more what we do and what I believe should be done more. I work in climate philanthropy, but I also represent SOIFC today, which is a youth-led organization. And what we've done a lot since we started working in that space was to connect with women-led organizations and indigenous-led organizations. Why? Because all those groups, they are not chronically underfunded and chronically challenged just by chance. Those groups are, put away from decision-making spaces because they represent a threat to the status quo. When indigenous groups come to me and they tell me, oh, we can feed the world, by healing the soil, we can revive traditional knowledge, we can restore, and we can do away with agriculture, industrial agriculture, it's a massive threat to the system. When young people come to me and tell me, you know what, I'm done with economic growth. I think we have to think of something different. I want to move past this system. It's a huge threat to the system, right? So those groups, by the very nature of what they do, are challenged, right? So I'm already 4 minutes into the speech. The time goes too fast. So now that we have established that, let me tell you 4 things that I believe we should be working on and that I invite also young people to think of. Do not confuse being empowered and asking for power, right? If you get a grant to go at COP and attend a few meetings, yeah, you might be empowered to a certain extent. But where does power lie once you go back home? So you have to ask for power. And if the stakeholders you engage with are serious about what they do, they will give you power. And power has many shapes and forms. It can be core, unearmarked funding to pursue your own agenda, to pursue your own narrative, or it can be a space in which you can really bring whoever you want, be political, and not be afraid to be transformative, right? That is actual power. It also means communication. Who do you talk to? What can you say to those people, right? So I always invite young people to be very mindful and not understand what is due and confuse that with charity. We don't do charity work. We do reparation work. We do addressing colonial dynamics, systems of oppressions that for centuries have oppressed the same people. So the work we do right now is about healing and asking for justice, right? This is the key element. The second is respect and trust, Whenever you go on a panel, whenever you go to a group, you have to ask for respect and for trust, And that means that I want people to trust me that I know what I'm doing and that the funds that I will be given or the space that I will be given will be used in a way that's effective, transformative, and that's going to be systemic. Because young people, by the nature of what they do, they think systemically. They understand that you can be young, indigenous, and come from an island, right? So if I was one of those people, I wouldn't know if I had to go to panel 1, 2, or 3. So how do we make sure that we are really systemic and we think across systems and we go beyond the siloed approach that the 21st century has trapped us into and that we inherit in the 21st century? The last one is the issue of time. Take your time. I always tell my people, don't fall into the dynamic of always running against certain KPIs that you have not decided for yourself. What does success mean? What does a fair energy transition mean? If I am, someone who works in a household in, let's say, Paris, right? And I want to go buy an EV. That's fair to me. I want to live in a clean city. But that EV needs critical minerals that come from outside of Europe. And maybe communities back then, they won't want their soil to be extracted for those minerals. So it's not fair to them. So whose fairness is worth more? I have my opinion in the system, but we have to make sure that when we talk about fairness, it's truly truly embedded socially and ecologically. And then I want to conclude, because I'm over time, with the issue of narrative. Where is knowledge created, and where does knowledge come from? Indigenous groups, youth organizations, we don't want to talk about frameworks which are not owned anymore. We want to build our own frameworks, our own narratives. The terms you use control the mindset you have, right? And when we talk about the SDGs, I really wonder to what extent, the most impacted groups were involved in those conversations. We just got off from the Summit of the Future. And again, we had the same issues of many, many groups not able to go to that space because New York is the most expensive city in the world. You can get a visa, you can get a hotel, then how are you supposed to go there and be in the right mindset to contribute to a narrative that you're going to have to use for so many decades, so many years, like the SDGs was used for many decades, right? So those are just a few critical things that I wanted to point out. I'm really happy to continue the conversation at a later stage. But I want to end by saying that the work we do is not charity work. It's justice work. And I always tell young people, don't say thank you when you go to a space. You just say, yeah, I should be here. I should be here. Right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adele, for those very interesting, innovative remarks, and observations, which certainly will also find their way along with those of the other high-level speakers in our think piece of the report section, which is the recommendations and ways forward, lessons learned. So thank you again. With that, I sincerely thank our esteemed keynote speaker, Martin, and our esteemed other speakers of the high-level segment, including those who were online, such as Christine and Minister Borge, and also Special Rapporteur Lisa Morgera, for having so well set the stage for what I'm convinced will be a very interesting, dense, and fruitful second part of this conference, comprising 3 panels on the empowerment, respectively, of youth, Indigenous peoples, and small island states in promoting environmental rights and climate justice. So thank you again very much. And in case you would want to leave, please feel free. Thank you. Good morning. Before I open the panels, allow me to make a few remarks about the aims of the conference and on the modalities of its proceedings. As I said, a substantive report will be issued by the Geneva Centre based upon the proceedings of this conference and on our own analysis and takeaways from the statements and all of the statements, of course. And the aim of the report is to perhaps serve as a preparatory background document for appropriate consideration by the stakeholders taking part in COP29. And we therefore appeal to all present to support this aim. Now, regarding the panel proceedings, participants online are requested that they be muted. As this conference is being recorded, you can keep your camera on if you wish, and write your questions in the chat box, because each panel will be followed by a Q&A session, and to the extent possible to specific panelists. And then after the third panel, I will open the interactive dialogue and take questions from the floor first, followed by questions from our online participants. I therefore invite the panelists of the first panel on youth, and request them to keep their statements to 6 minutes to the extent possible, so that we stay in time. So I would like to, we have Anja. I will introduce you as in one, and you would be Nana. And then we have online. Okay, good. So the others are online. So let me begin with the first speaker on this panel on youth, who is Anja Tresse. Tell me, how is it pronounced? Anja or Anja?
Anja Tresse.
Anja Tresse, Program Manager, Youth and Peace of the Kofi Annan Foundation. Anja has a strong focus on empowering young leaders, and she drives innovative initiatives that promote peace building and conflict resolution on a global scale, fostering collaboration among diverse youth communities. Anja, the floor is yours.
So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for creating this space. Thank you to the Geneva Centre for putting together this panel. And as you mentioned, I'm Anja Tresse. I am the Program Manager for Climate, Peace and Youth at the Kofi Annan Foundation. So how does conflict and climate change overlap? And how can we better support young people who are already confronting these overlapping crises? As the Kofi Annan Foundation, we sought to explore these questions over the past months, but we knew from the beginning that while there is an increasing amount of research and policy on this topic, we wanted to go to the source and we wanted to actually involve young people themselves in producing this knowledge and answering these questions. So over the past few months, we've conducted youth-driven research called Environment of Peace across 6 countries, Burkina Faso, Niger, Pakistan, the Philippines, Somalia, and Uganda, to answer how young people are affected by and respond to climate change, environmental degradation, and conflict. So for today, I would like to share a few findings and reflection from this research. And one is specifically on how climate and conflict immediately impacts youth. 2, how the importance of integrated solutions to these interconnected issues are highlighted. And 3, what is the role of youth-driven research and action in responding to these challenges? So our research reveals that the intersection of climate change and peace is not a distant issue, but a pressing crisis that is impacting youth now. We've heard this throughout the panel today, I think, and also from the minister from the Philippines. And Philippines is a country that ranks as the #1 most vulnerable to climate change and to extreme weather events. Niger and Somalia that we've done studies in are both highly vulnerable. They have increasing desertification and water scarcity, and this then intersects and collides with local conflicts over land. In Uganda, we also saw how prolonged droughts have triggered competition over water resources, leading to conflicts between herders and farmers. And an important point in all of this is that we know that countries that are most affected by climate and fragility have large youth populations. So what this creates is overlapping vulnerabilities in which both climate change and conflict affect young people. It affects their livelihoods, especially for those who are in climate-sensitive sectors like agriculture. It forces many young people to turn to migration. And with reduced resources in communities and societies, and often in combination with perhaps low presence of government or state institutions, this creates an increase of power and influence of armed groups and violent actors, and it also increases attractiveness of joining them. This is also gendered, these vulnerabilities. We know that women also face increased risk of gender-based violence and exploitation, both in climate change-affected areas and in conflict-affected areas. And finally, I wanted to talk about how young people actually respond to these complex issues, because they do respond. They are not just victims, they're actually first responders in some ways. They play an important role, and while donors and institutions, NGOs and INGOs often operate in silos, treating these issues perhaps separately, young people are already breaking these silos. And we've seen that in, for example, Burkina Faso, youth-led initiatives successfully integrated sustainable agriculture with peace-building efforts, which improved food security, but also reduced conflicts over scarce resources and strengthened resilience. So I think that youth are showing that collaboration across disciplines leads to more effective and sustainable outcomes. And we, as the kind of broader international community, ought to follow their lead, especially through better funding models, better policy making and design, and actually through programmatic interventions. And what this research has also shown is that there is a huge power in youth-driven action. In countries like Pakistan and Somalia, young people are not just concerned or thinking about climate change, they are forced to respond to it because it directly threatens their livelihoods and safety. This is not a strategic decision for them that they have taken after some policy discussions. It's a matter of survival. And I think it is very clear that young people are not just thinking about these issues, they are forced by their circumstances to act now, and we all should be. From the national to the international, actors at all levels need to empower them with tools, funding, and support. And above all, I think this requires a lot of trust. To highlight this, I'm just highlighting some recommendations from our young researchers. So one is to support local solutions, create opportunities for sustainable livelihoods, create alternative income streams like green agriculture and renewable energy projects. And this sounds very good, but it also requires collaboration and integrated responses and partnerships between NGOs, private sector, governments. So again, integrated solutions. Another point is to focus on marginalized groups. All adaptation strategies and intervention must be tailored to their specific vulnerabilities, whether that's Indigenous people or women or youth. And to promote cross-disciplinary multi-level exchanges. And I think we've heard that a lot today, but the importance of actually having young people involved in these discussions, not only as kind of a speaker, but actually being in the decision-making room, forming policies and practice. And we must increase collaboration not only between generations, but also between the climate and peace sector. Sometimes we see each other as competition, trying to get, each other's funding and that kind of thing. And that mindset really needs to stop. And at the Kofi Annan Foundation, we hope to take this recommendation specifically forward. And we are trying to now see how can we help to create bridges between sectors, between generations, how can we create these spaces, and how can we fund and support these actions going forward. And we often talk about how do we go from policy to practice, but young people are often already at the implementation stage. They're already there, they already have the ideas, the energy, and the solutions that are needed, but they need trust, they need support, and they need platforms to ensure that they succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anya. I now give the floor to our next in-presence speaker of this panel, Mrs. Nana Kurashvili, who is international consultant on youth participation. And Nana has extensive experience in designing and implementing programs that amplify the voices of youth, young people, in decision-making processes. She is dedicated to fostering inclusive environments that empower youth to drive social changes globally. Over to you, Nana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Geneva Centre for the invitation. Dear colleagues, dear friends, as we sit here today in this beautiful building, hundreds of thousands of young people at this right moment suffer from hurricanes and floods, wildfires and loss of biodiversity, earthquakes and air pollution. And this has direct impact on their life, on their health and well-being, on their employment and education. And yes, this is a human rights issue that can be addressed from only length of justice. And we all know that young people have been at the forefront of the climate action for many years now. It's thanks to their fierce determination, dedication, and non-conformist nature that they really brought truly global and universal attention to the issue of climate change. And in response, they have been dismissed, they have been rejected, ignored, and harassed for many years. And this needs to change. Of course, we acknowledge the gains. We see certain progress made in the recent years, such was the establishment of official youth constituency by UNFCCC, most recently establishment of the Youth Climate Champion. But the pace of this progress is nowhere near the speed of emergency of the climate change. And this needs to be addressed. Youth organizations face multiple obstacles on a number of different levels, which arise from financial, structural, and even societal issues. And let me share with you a few of them, since I've been working with grassroots organizations for many years. First of all, they have very limited resources. They operate under very tight budgets, which does not allow them to scale their projects, to have long-term and sustainable initiatives, and even to participate in international climate forums. And sometimes when we speak about youth organizations, it's a self-organized group of small groups of people who sometimes don't even have office space and basic equipment to operate their everyday activities. Second, they lack capacities. Despite the passion and dedication youth activists have, these are really newborn and small organizations which lack technical capacities in climate science, for example. It's difficult for them to navigate in the complexities of human rights or environmental laws, and this is a big challenge for them. As IPU Secretary General mentioned earlier today, they are not represented in political decision making. Not only they are not sufficiently represented in COP negotiations, they're not members of their own parliaments. As he mentioned, less than 3% of young people are young parliamentarians, while majority of the global population is under the age of 13. And lastly, they have limited access to public information when it comes to climate justice and environmental rights, not only because of the lack of the technical capacities and knowledge of how to navigate in this complex system, but also many governments in different countries hinder this opportunity to young people and doesn't allow them free access to this information. So how can we address it in the practical way beyond our words of encouragement, which is of course important, but there is something specific that needs to be done to address these issues. First, we need to have dedicated grant schemes for youth organization, and it can be done really easily within already existing climate financing instruments. It is just a matter of a political will. Second, we need to build capacities of these organizations, not only in terms of their technical capacities in legislation and regulation-related issues, but with more soft skills such as negotiations, campaigning, and advocacy, because they need to have stronger messaging and even bigger outreach than they have today. And most importantly, we need to give them trust, as Anya has already mentioned and many of the speakers today, because young people really have something unique about their actions. It's not about only their dedication and their non-conformist nature, but it's something which is very important for the climate action. They are the ones who can change their attitudes and change their behaviors earlier than any other people. And these everyday actions, these everyday habits are what has huge impact on our climate response and climate change response. That's why we need to support them and do everything in our power to give them this ability to change attitudes in their communities at the grassroots level. Because technical language at the negotiations may not be relatable to communities in different parts of the world, but what is done in their own cities and villages is something that affects their everyday life. So I think we need to support them in this endeavor, and this will be something that all of us can benefit from. I would like to conclude by Kofi Annan's words: have confidence in the young people, give them a chance, and they will surprise you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nana, for a very interesting statement, which will also find its way, the main takeaways in our main report, outcome report. I now we have three other panelists who will speak online. So I will give the floor to the next panelist who is online, Veena Balakrishnan. Veena is the co-founder of the Youth Negotiators Academy, where she empowers youth activists with the skills and knowledge needed for effective negotiation and advocacy. Were I to have been younger, I would have maybe taken some lessons in your academy. With a passion for youth engagement in policy discussions, she champions initiatives that elevate youth voices in global forums. Veena, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It was absolutely fantastic to listen to many others before me. And I was thinking everybody's voice was united in some form to talk about elevating young people, supporting their leadership, the kind of power sharing and power shifting that's required. So I know that we are all united on those ideologies, but what I see is sometimes lacking is that there is a group of people calling for that change and for that support, and there are institutions who are saying, yes, I am hearing you, I totally am with you, and they take pictures with young activists, they shake hands and they say, we are working with young people, but are they working with young people? No. So for me, as one of the founders of the Youth Negotiators Academy, how it all started off was to say that we've been talking about and seeing the systemic and structural barriers to enabling young people to be decision makers. And we wanted to take it in our hands and say, okay, how do we understand the system better? And how can we work with the system and disrupt the system to redress this systemic and structural inequality of young people's representation in the multilateral processes? So my introduction was slightly off, so I would just introduce myself. So I'm one of the founders of the Youth Negotiators Academy. We train and build capacity for young people as decision makers to the UNFCCC and UNCCD process at the moment. How we do this is by working directly with the national focal points for the processes within the individual countries, and we sign agreements with them on capacity development, community network development, and also advocacy support and financial support. We fund all the negotiators that we train to be at the UNFCCC and the UNCCD meetings as well. And in return, we ask the countries to give them negotiation mandates that are official, that gets them having an equal right. Paper-wise, that power is being shared, and they get to be having the access to the negotiation and the decision-making tables, just like any other decision maker over there, and meaningfully empower them. So this is primarily what we do, and our vision is to see how can youth leadership. We've been talking about this. There is a hypothesis that young people are innovative and the energy needs to be in the decision-making space, because then we can, there's a chance that we could have more progressive and ambitious outcome. And through the initiative, we sort of test this. So we use youth leadership as a tool for ambitious outcomes to put that trust back in the multilateral system, because I see a lot of headlines, COP after COP, people saying that, this COP, there was not much of a outcome that has come. We need to wait for the next COP. So, or the climate crisis is a leadership crisis, or the environmental crisis is a leadership crisis. And we keep hearing that, and we really want to use youth leadership as a tool for that. So I'm going to quickly go through how we innovate and how we make this work, so that it also looks like a proof of concept for the ideas that we've all been talking about. So we work on 4 pillars of work streams. So the first is capacity development. Young negotiators nominated by their countries, they go through a very intense capacity development program for 6 months, and that is from June to November each year, and then they are prepared and are ready for the upcoming COPs as negotiators. We make sure that in this process, so we work like a tripartite system. So the country, us, and the negotiator. So we train the negotiator. So we give a certain kind of knowledge to the negotiator, which is more overarching and multilateral level. The country has to also engage them meaningfully, give them access to documents, include them while preparing country positions for these COPs, and really
il Reno clapping pieno. L'acqua le arrivate a fine a mulinello.
Sorry. Sorry, ma'am. In case you were asking me something, you can put the question in the chat. I will take it later. So that's one side of it, where we are training them systematically and making sure that we are working in that triangular system. The second is community and network building. We definitely recognize that sometimes negotiations are more than what you know. It's also about who you know and how you can then influence the decisions and the outcomes. And therefore, we put a strong emphasis on negotiators being connected amongst themselves. And this is enabled through the cohort kind of process cohort kind of training setup that we have. So this year, for example, we're working with almost 83 countries, training for UNFCCC and UNCCD negotiations, which means that negotiators from 83 countries are spending time together for 6 months. That builds solidarity and it enables in consensus building when it comes to the decision making itself, which is one of the most powerful tools that we can give negotiators. The third is funding. Some of my youth colleague panelists as well mentioned the importance of funding and the lack of funding, especially when it comes for young people. One is, as initiatives, we have less funding, but also the young negotiators we train, they're also not funded to participate in the UNFCCC or the UNCCD meetings. So then we raise funds separately to be able to fund the negotiators that we train, because we recognize the value. If you're not inside, how are you going to show your leadership, and how is the world then going to recognize that yes, young people can bring the change? So this is a really important part. So we also ensure funding support for all of the negotiators that we train, based on their economic vulnerability and status, of course. And nobody has to pay. None of the countries that we work with needs to pay for the training that we provide as well. This is to make sure that the countries and the institutions that are required to empower these young people are not using this as an excuse for not enabling the young people. So these are the three of our work streams. And the last is advocacy, which is advocacy with the countries, onboarding them, getting them to really buy into intergenerational leadership and justice and collaboration as a concept for them. And also being a part of forums like these and really talking more and getting the voices of young people, and also showcasing that there's hope even with the existing system for us to be able to do what is required at the moment to support young people, Indigenous people, women, all of them. So that's primarily how we then work. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take later. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Veena, for that statement. And I now have the pleasure of giving the floor to our next panelist online, Lolita Kushen, who is a future generations rights advocate and campaigner with World's Youth for Climate Justice, where she actively promotes youth inclusion in climate discussions. You have the floor, Lolita, and if you could really keep to 6 minutes, because we are running over time and we have still 2 other panels. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very honored to stand before you all today, dear distinguished guests, dear distinguished panelists. First of all, I would like to talk as a campaigner for World Youth for Climate Justice, which is a youth international organization which is advocating on the adversary opinion on the ICJ, International Court of Justice, that was evoked by speakers during this event. And so about this AO, I always like to recall the history of it, because there is a crucial role of young people that was played here in this historical procedure happening at the ICJ. The journey leading up to the ICJ being asked to answer this legal question, was the involvement of youth-led action, especially from the Pacific region. It all began with a group of 27 law students from University of the South Pacific, who in 2019 had this idea of an advisory opinion. And they convinced Vanuatu government and formed the Pacific Island Student Fighting Climate Change. So they convinced the government advocating for this ID. And that's how this diplomatic lead happened. And that's what led to this great victory in March 2023 of the United Nations General Assembly to ask the International Court of Justice this legal question, really ambitious about future generations and climate justice. So today, this procedure is ongoing, and as we wait for the oral hearings to begin in December, the beginning of December, this youth-driven initiative stands as a powerful example of how young people are not only advocating for their future, but shaping what is happening in legal discourse on climate justice and being innovative with that. So this AO is a chance to solidify the legal obligations of states and ensuring that the principle of intergenerational equity and climate justice and future generation rights are upheld, like all these important subjects that was evoked by all the distinguished panelists. We also talked about the COP. I went to COP 28 with my distinguished colleagues, Altina Vidobay, and had the opportunity to advocate for inclusion of youth perspectives in the written contribution of states for the International Court of Justice. But now that how we approach COP 29, the focus is now on ensuring youth can be included in oral hearings at the International Court of Justice, which is really intergovernmental, but we advocate for youth to be included in delegation of states and also for our legal argument that we developed to be included in statements. This is a critical moment for advancing the inclusion of youth voices and securing powerful statements from states that can influence our future global climate action. So I want to recall that this advisory opinion has the potential to guide us toward a safer and more just future by providing this legal clarity we all need and accelerate key issues like phasing out fossil fuels, climate damage funds, transitioning to just sustainable economies, and all this. And young people continue to push for this ambitious ICJ-AO. Now, maybe as a specialist and graduate on the field of rights of future generation, I want to say that this AO is an opportunity also to break the law silos that was also a subject evoked in this event, and to have like clear interpretation of obligations to protect future generations. We observe a dynamic in this sense that I welcome because I'm convinced future generation is a driver to protect environment and empower indigenous people and young people. And with this advisory opinion, it is a driver for that. And we also have other events like the AO from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea that also shows that member state obligations go beyond UNFCCC and Paris Agreement on Climate Change. We also have the Pact for the Future that was evoked with its annex, the Declaration of Future Generations, where I am the chance to follow closely the negotiations for in New York. That for the first time imposed the subject of future generations. And the AO must be like a way to go even further by interpreting the law and the obligations, legal obligations towards future generations. Then to finish my statement, I would like to talk as a young person myself involved in climate justice and highlight, as other panelists highlighted, that despite the growing recognition of youth as key stakeholders, we still have significant barriers remaining to have meaningful participation, especially in these diplomatic and decision-making spaces. Too often, youth are invited to speak, but not to act, like to share our ideas, but not to implement them ourselves. So I think we are not just asking to be included in the discussion, but also like our ideas to be valued and to be part of the implementation of them. We also still have a lack of representation of youth people. We are talking about indigenous peoples. We need youth indigenous peoples and youth people from developing countries. And for that, we need more financing. And for this involvement to not remain symbolic, it should be substantive, because we have an expertise, we have knowledge, we have skills, and we are ready to take in charge and manage projects and implement our great ideas in collaboration with all of you. So thank you so much for your intentions and for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lolita, for that inspiring statement. With that, I come to the last panelist who is online of this panel, Mrs. Shrishti Gautam, who is the National Coordinator of World's Youth for Climate Justice in Nepal and a law and economics student at Kathmandu University. And she has over 3 years of grassroots experience mobilizing youth coalitions and to advocate for climate justice. With that, Shrishti, you have the floor. And if I may, as a kind reminder, and 6 minutes to make your statement because we have to keep the time limits. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. It is actually an eye-opening moment for me to be here with my fellow panelists and hear them speak. As we focus on empowering youth, indigenous peoples, and small island states for climate justice and environmental rights, I cannot help but also think of my own country, Nepal, that is a mountainous country and is as well highly vulnerable to climatic risks. Now, when we talk about youth in context of climate justice, we're not just referring to people who will be affected in the future. We are already experiencing the devastating impacts of climate change. For example, just last month in Nepal, across all 3 geographical regions, 250 people lost their lives. Our capital city, Kathmandu, recorded the highest rainfall in 54-year history, causing floods and landslides. Bodies were recovered from vehicles buried under landslides on the national highway near Kathmandu. Many people also lost their families, homes, and property. Hospitals are still overwhelmed, and the most vulnerable populations are actually suffering the most. This shows that climate crisis is also a class crisis. And I know this is heartbreaking to hear, and we are experiencing this firsthand. And today, I also got to hear about such similar problems from all around the world. And it is actually overwhelming. But today, amidst of all of these problems, I want to talk about a little bit of hope about some good practices that have been developed and put in place. But before such practices are put in place, I want to emphasize that first, youths must by themselves take bold steps, raising our voices and demanding for the climate action from governments, legislatures, and judicial bodies. I will share some examples from Nepal and my own experience of how youth-led efforts have created real change in fight for environmental rights. In Nepal, for instance, I've seen how many of the youths have come together to form powerful coalitions advocating for environmental rights and sustainable development to gain governmental and legislative support. And yes, it is not always negative like what we have in our mind. When youth movements are well organized and deliver a clear message, governments often do respond. In Nepal, we've seen this through the creation of youth consortiums and consultations by our government, where young people like myself contribute directly to shaping national climate positions ahead of international conferences like COP29 that is going to happen soon. We just don't provide input, we're also involved to help craft the policies that our leaders are taking to the global stage materially as well. Further, one of the powerful tools that we have for youth participation is the constitutional right to peaceful assembly, like in many countries as well. This has allowed us to organize large scale climate marches, including People's Climate March we recently organized in Nepal, where thousands of young people marched to demand climate action. Our protests were not ignored, and we also used various methods like peaceful methods of art and showing cultures, dances from all around Nepal in this protest. And it was a huge success. Government also listened to us and began to take action. Now, talking about judiciary also, It has time and again supported youth-led environmental activism. One powerful example from Nepal is about the Nisgad airport case, where the government planned to build an airport that would require clearing large sections of forest, threatening biodiversity and displacing communities. But youth activists stood against this. We mobilized, raised awareness, and eventually brought the issue to the court. And the judiciary did step in and halted the project, ordering a review of the environmental impacts. And this case again proved that when youth build strong coalitions and present a solid fact-based case, even courts and judicial organs do listen. After that, governments and legislative bodies have also introduced other concrete mechanisms to ensure youths are included in environmental decisions. For example, one of the common practice is about the environmental impact assessment, EIA, and strategic environmental assessments, both of which require public participation. In many cases, youth voices are a key part of this process when ensuring that our concerns and sustainability, environmental protection, and socio-economic impacts are addressed via youths. So, yeah, even for our own campaign of ICJ-AO in Nepal, one of the former Supreme Court Justice, Honorable Ananda Mohan Sir, has stood up as our backbone, supporting us in every step for government lobbying as well. So this is also example that how judiciary has impacted and helped youths. Another critical mechanism that the government has put in place is the concept of informed consent, particularly when projects affect indigenous peoples or local communities. That, in case of development projects, and in this case as well, youths, especially from indigenous backgrounds, are included to create more rigorous consent procedures. I almost missed out on this. Another prominent example is from our own organization itself, that is World Youth for Climate Justice. As Lolita also said, our network constantly advocates for stronger international action on climate change globally and pushes governments to engage with ICJ-AO process hearing. Even in this case, the government of Nepal did take our movement into account, and we were also included while drafting the written submissions in Nepal. And Nepal is also going to take part in oral hearings that is going to happen in December in Hague, and that is all because of the youth movements that were happening in Nepal. So yeah, these were some examples. And to close, I want to emphasize that youths are not passive bystanders in the fight for climate justice. We are active leaders. Government, legislative bodies, and judicial systems do support and must continue to support and amplify our voices, ensuring that we have tools and platforms needed to make meaningful contributions. And at COP29 and on our other conferences as such and beyond, we will continue to push for policies that protect both planet and our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Srishti, for those observations and remarks and analysis. That brings us to the end of this first panel on youth empowerment. And in case there are any very quick questions from the floor, if that is not the case, I will move on. We can move on to the second panel on Indigenous peoples, their empowerment in the promotion of environmental rights and climate justice. And just to begin, before I give the floor to our first online panelist, to quote Guterres, our UN Secretary General, who at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues said, "For thousands of years, Indigenous peoples have pioneered sustainable land management and climate adaptation. They are the guardians of the world's biodiversity." With that, thank you. I now give the floor to our first panelist, who will be online, Judge Ana Manuela Ochoa Arias, who serves on the Special Tribunal for Peace in Colombia, where she plays a key role in addressing transitional justice and accountability for conflict-related crimes. Judge, the floor is yours.
Bueno, buenos días. Buenos días para todos y todas. Yo voy a hacer mi presentación en español. Quisiera preguntar si está bien para ustedes.
I don't think so. I was expecting this to be in English, but we can make it short, and we can make a summary in our report. Thank you.
Ok. Bueno, buenos días para todos y todas. Aprovecho para agradecerles la invitación que me han hecho para participar en esta conferencia y también para agradecerles su interés en este tema tan delicado como el que nos convoca, los derechos ambientales y la justicia climática. Voy a presentarme para que sepan un poco cuál es el lugar desde el que hablo. Mi nombre es Ana Manuela Ochoa Arias, soy una mujer indígena del pueblo Cancuamo de la Sierra Nevada de Gonavindúa, corazón del mundo, y miembro de uno de los 115 pueblos que pervivimos en Colombia. Actualmente soy magistrada de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. En ese sentido, mis respuestas las voy a abordar desde mi experiencia como integrante de un pueblo indígena y como funcionaria de la institución de la que hago parte, y donde creo que se han realizado valiosos avances en esta materia. Quiero empezar a contestar algunas de las preguntas haciendo un breve contexto sobre mi país y sobre los pueblos indígenas. En mi país habitamos 115 pueblos indígenas. Cada uno cuenta con sus propias estructuras de organización social, política, económica, sistemas de salud, de educación y sistemas de justicia propios. En este país existen 65 lenguas nativas o idiomas originarios indígenas distintos al español y nos ubicamos geográficamente en todo el territorio nacional. Algunos pueblos incluso trascienden las fronteras nacionales con países como Venezuela, Ecuador, Brasil y Perú. Colombia es el segundo país de Latinoamérica con mayor diversidad humana y lingüística y es también uno de los países con mayor diversidad biológica. Ahora también la historia de Colombia da cuenta de casi 60 años de conflicto armado, donde a pesar de la suscripción de acuerdos de paz y de un arduo trabajo en ese sentido, el conflicto armado persiste. Y respondiendo a una de las preguntas que ustedes me formularon, el conflicto armado es uno de los mayores obstáculos que enfrentan las organizaciones lideradas por indígenas y por defensoras y defensores de los derechos ambientales y de la justicia climática. Recientemente, la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos anunció que en los últimos años Colombia ha reportado un total de 248 líderes y defensores ambientales asesinados. Y según este informe, el 89% de las víctimas eran indígenas, afrodescendientes y campesinos. En Colombia, defender el derecho a un medio ambiente limpio, saludable y sostenible, y los derechos vinculados a la defensa de la tierra y del territorio, conlleva un alto riesgo a la vida y a la integridad personal, dice este informe. Pero no se trata solamente del asesinato de defensores y defensoras de la madre tierra y de los derechos de la naturaleza, que eso es claramente grave. Aquí, en mi país, en el marco del conflicto armado, también se ha destruido el territorio y la naturaleza. Así lo señala, y perdón que hable desde lo que han dicho otros, pero es mi labor como juez no hablar porque puedo prejuzgar. Entonces, esto también lo ha dicho la Comisión de la Verdad de Colombia en su reciente informe. Es decir, también se ha referido a la destrucción del territorio y la naturaleza. En En este informe de la Comisión de la Verdad se ha dicho que la tala indiscriminada de bosque, la siembra extensiva de cultivos de coca, la minería ilegal y también la legal, la apertura de vías y de pistas de aterrizajes clandestinas en medio de la selva, la voladura de oleoductos, la instalación de minas antipersona, el vertimiento de excedentes químicos, del procesamiento de la pasta de base de coca, la contaminación de las fuentes de agua con mercurio y químicos para la extracción minera, así como la aspersión aérea de glifosato y el abandono de municiones sin explotar ha generado enormes daños a la naturaleza. Y en este marco, digamos, a pesar de ese panorama tan negativo que tenemos de destrucción a la naturaleza y al territorio, considero que una de las contribuciones que han hecho hasta ahora los pueblos y las organizaciones indígenas al sistema legal colombiano está en que estos daños y afectaciones que ha sufrido el territorio y la naturaleza han permitido que estas entidades vivientes sean consideradas víctimas del conflicto armado. Así las cosas, los daños ya no se centran solo en los seres humanos. Aquí hay otros seres que también han sido afectados por el conflicto armado y con ellos también hay que hacer la paz. Y ustedes han notado, han visto que este es uno de los lemas de la COP16 que se está realizando en Cali, Colombia. Esta concepción del territorio como víctima fue inicialmente consignada en normas legales colombianas y posteriormente ha sido desarrollada por la jurisprudencia de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, en donde ya se ha acreditado el territorio de varios pueblos indígenas como víctimas. En uno de los autos que acredita el territorio como víctima, se anotó que para algunos pueblos indígenas las experiencias de la guerra no se agotan en el daño ocasionado a las personas, sino que sus consecuencias se inscriben también en la mirada de seres que habitan sus territorios y en el mismo entorno natural. La desaparición de espíritus protectores describe una serie de efectos que trascienden los ámbitos humanos, es decir, afectan tanto los derechos de las personas como el entramado de relaciones en el que gente, lugares y agencias no humanas participan. Más bien, cuando los humanos dañan a los no humanos o a la naturaleza, se crea un desequilibrio energético que conlleva cambios en la vida física. Esto ya lo ha dicho una decisión judicial de esta Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Ahora, frente a la pregunta de cuáles son una de las mejores prácticas existentes para abordar las necesidades, los derechos y las contribuciones de los pueblos indígenas, es importante recordar y destacar que los saberes de los pueblos indígenas se construyen desde la práctica, la vivencia cotidiana y la oralidad, los cuales se transmiten de generación en generación. Los pueblos indígenas somos pueblos que nos hemos dedicado a salvaguardar los derechos de la naturaleza. Cuidado y protección que va desde nuestras formas de comprendernos con el mundo natural, desde una perspectiva inescindible e interrelacional, hasta los distintos mecanismos de resistencia y de defensa que se han librado para proteger los territorios de su explotación. Porque los pueblos indígenas consideramos el territorio y la naturaleza como una entidad viviente, como un cuerpo viviente interconectado que está siendo maltratado y violentado de diversas maneras. Por otra parte, creo que es muy importante tener presente que varias cosmovisiones indígenas explican el inicio de la vida de forma interrelacionada e interdependiente con todos los seres que habitan el universo, donde los seres humanos somos apenas una minúscula parte de ese entramado de relaciones. Y desde ese lugar es desde donde los pueblos contribuyen al cuidado del territorio y de la naturaleza. Pero no solo son prácticas, son diferentes formas de concebir el mundo en armonía y en respeto con todo lo que existe. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Judge Matroa Arias. With that, I give the floor to our second panelist on this important panel, Mr. Romel Antonio Cuenca, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines, where he leads national efforts in climate change mitigation and adaptation. Romel, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chair. And in behalf of my minister who spoke earlier, Robert Duarte, we'd like to thank the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for making us in the Climate Change Commission of the Philippines part of today's conversation. So, distinguished panelists, esteemed guests, we recognize the deep connection between indigenous peoples and nature, a connection that is foundational to achieve the climate goals we have set. The Philippines takes pride in its constitutional and legal framework that promotes and upholds the rights of IPs. Our 1987 Philippine Constitution recognizes their ancestral lands and cultural integrity. Building on this, we have a domestic law called the Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1997, which addresses historical injustices as it protects the right to ancestral domains, self-governance, cultural integrity, and social justice. However, protecting rights is only part of the solution as IPs contribute deeply to climate action. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change recognizes that IPs safeguard 80% of the world's biodiversity, which is why their traditional knowledge and resilience strategies are crucial for climate adaptation efforts, as noted in the IPCC 6th Assessment Report. Globally, the recognition of indigenous peoples in climate action has grown. The Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, or LCIPP, at the UNFCCC provides a space for sharing best practices in climate resilience. This platform helps empower indigenous voices to shape global policies that affect their communities and the planet. In the Philippines, we integrate indigenous knowledge and participation through various initiatives. One example is our own Communities for Resilience program of the Climate Change Commission. This program builds the capacities of local governments and indigenous groups to craft their local climate change action plans and conduct climate and disaster risk assessments. These tools ensure that local communities, especially IPs, are equipped to face climate impacts. Yet significant challenges remain. The impacts of climate change threatens the lands and livelihoods that sustain IP communities. Looking forward to the 29th Conference of the Parties, or COP29, we must amplify indigenous voices, and capacity building, technology transfer, and addressing knowledge gaps are crucial. COP29 presents an opportunity for indigenous communities to further shape climate action agendas. Our collective challenge, therefore, is to ensure that human rights remain central in climate policies. Climate change disproportionately affects vulnerable communities, especially indigenous peoples. States must fulfill their human rights obligations while addressing climate impacts. Only through equity and justice can we ensure a future world where no one is left behind. In closing, let us continue to honor IB rights, elevate their voices, and ensure that their knowledge is integrated into global solutions for climate justice. Thank you, and we look forward to very productive discussions ahead.
Thank you very much indeed, Deputy Director Romel. Thank you. I now give the floor to my right, Mrs. Cecilia Zerbini, who will be the next panelist on this panel, to speak for about 6-7 minutes. She is the focal point for indigenous peoples and climate change at the International Organization for Migration, popularly known as IOM, and where she advocates for the rights of indigenous communities affected by climate change, working to ensure their inclusion in global migration and environmental policies. Cecilia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to be joining this event and for the opportunity of adding a bit to this important discussion on the side of migration. So climate change is also one of the key priority topics at IOM. And as we speak about climate change and its impacts on communities, it's very important to consider also about human mobility, which includes migration, displacement, and planned relocations. The IOM sees firsthand the impacts of climate change and environmental degradation on human mobility patterns, which are already visible to different groups of people across the world. For example, in the previous panel, it was mentioned as well by Miss Anya with the study done with youth, and it also happens with indigenous peoples. And when it comes to these peoples, the impacts can be due, for example, we have already seen this happening due to coastal erosion and sea level rise, which lead to planned relocation of communities in some small island states, for example, or due to wildfires and deforestation, which affect habitat loss and then affect the traditional livelihoods of these communities, such as in places such as the Amazon, which can bring them to migrate in search of alternatives. And there's changing rain patterns, droughts, land degradation, and other climate change related events pose similar threats around the world, leading to water scarcity, food insecurity, sometimes conflict over resources, and this can force communities to move out of their places of origin. And indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to the climate crisis, being largely reliant on the environment for both their subsistence and their cultural identity. So it's really important to consider particularly the non-economic losses that can come from being forced to move. As we know, most indigenous communities are intrinsically connected to their ancestral lands, having their very identities tied to it. And losing that connection can cause profound psychological impacts, as it puts at risk every aspect of their identities that is tied to their lands, which can include traditional knowledge, social networks, cultural heritage, and migration can also threaten the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. Not to mention the fact that forced migration can increase their vulnerabilities, as they have to move to unfamiliar urban spaces and often also end up in more climate vulnerable locations. When it is done in a safe and regular manner, migration can be a form of adaptation to climate change impacts. But given this context and given their ties to their ancestral lands, if they had a choice, and that's the key word here, most indigenous peoples and communities would likely not choose to move. They would choose to stay. And to IOM, this is an essential part of achieving and promoting climate justice. It's to make sure that people have a choice over their migration decisions, which has not always been the case. And as mentioned, the movements of indigenous peoples due to impacts of climate change and environmental degradation are already happening. And that's why at IOM, our main objectives when it comes to migration, environment, climate change, and risk reduction are providing solutions for people who need to move and for people who are already on the move. But it also includes providing solutions for people to stay, if that is their choice, in their places of origin. And in this regard, we also need to remember that indigenous peoples and communities are very important actors in the fight against climate change, which has been a very key point throughout this discussion. Traditional knowledge or science and leadership needs to be respected, acknowledged, and leveraged in climate action. There is a growing recognition, as was just mentioned right before me, of the role of indigenous and local knowledge in climate change adaptation and nature conservation. And these forms of knowledge are crucial for strengthening adaptation efforts, policy, and practice, for accelerating climate resilience, for better addressing climate risks, and for achieving climate justice. So the integration of indigenous and local knowledge and practices into global climate strategies is essential for achieving meaningful progress in addressing climate change. So indigenous people are and should be part of the solution in facing climate change and environmental degradation. So as was mentioned before, there's this key motto, so nothing for us without us. They need to be included, and they need to be part of the solution in order to achieve this possibility of them choosing whether to migrate or not, or to stay in their lands. Since one of our objectives here is to also share and identify best practices towards this effort, I would like to join today's panelists in sharing some examples of how IOM engages with Indigenous communities and relies on their knowledge in addressing this nexus between migration, environment, and climate change. One example is in Paraguay. IOM is working hand in hand with the Paraguayan Indigenous Institute to strengthen the capacities of the government to address the mobility of indigenous communities in the context of climate change, environmental degradation, and deforestation, to contribute to the prevention of forced migration of these communities due to these issues. So the project is heavily based on protocols of consultation and free, prior, and informed consent. And IOM is holding community dialogues with the communities in the country to carry out a participatory diagnosis with them on this nexus. So their inputs, their participation is the basis of this project. IOM is also committed to ensuring and promoting the participation of Indigenous peoples in relevant climate discussions. For example, we have mentioned the UNFCCC COP processes, and IOM has sponsored and facilitated Indigenous participation in these conferences, ensuring the attendance of representatives from different Indigenous groups, as well as Indigenous youth, such as through this year's COP29 Youth Delegates on Climate Migration Initiative, which has been rolled out this year and is bringing young people to give them a space as negotiators, as speakers at events, and to actively participate in COP. And to conclude, IOM acknowledges that the need to give visibility to the issues of climate change, migration, and Indigenous people at the global policy level. We need to continue increasing our understanding of how climate change and environmental degradation impact the migration of Indigenous people in different parts of the world. And we need to think of the potential solutions for this. But the only way to do that is to speak with the Indigenous peoples and communities, to listen to their stories, to build on their wealth of traditional knowledge or science and experience, and to ensure that they fully participate to the development of the appropriate responses. And only then will migration be a choice and not a necessity for these communities. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for those statements and that statement and those remarks and observations, which will be very useful indeed in understanding all the issues, complex issues of Indigenous peoples. I now give the floor to our second last speaker on this panel, Mrs. Donna Mitzi Lagdameo, who is the team lead for the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform Unit at UN Climate Change. Donna, you have the floor for about 6 to 7 minutes, please. Thank you. Donna, you need to unmute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And greetings from Bonn. Thank you so much, colleagues, for organizing this event and for giving us an opportunity to contribute. It has been a really fantastic session from the start because I've been hearing several speakers really talk about the importance of Indigenous knowledge, the recognition of the unique but transformational role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the process, and also referencing the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. So allow me to use my 6 minutes to share with you the roadmap that we have actually used, but I wouldn't want to focus on just from Dubai to Baku. As you all know, the Conference of the Parties, the COP sessions are not events, are not standalone events, but these are continuing sessions wherein parties continue to find ways and discuss and negotiate ways on how we can really collectively address the issue of climate change and reach the goals of the Paris Agreement collectively. So my story begins in 1992, where even at the main text of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, we already could see the importance parties have put forward in terms of the recognition of addressing the issues of climate change across generations. So the intergenerational equity has really started back 30 years ago, at least in the climate process. And this actually has evolved from 92 to 2024. And we could see a lot of shifts, not just in the operationalization of inclusivity, but also in shaping of the narratives and how Indigenous peoples and local communities have moved from just being recognized as a vulnerable community to now leading the space in helping us have mindset shifts and helping us really think differently on how we can actually address the impacts of climate change. So as I mentioned, in 92, this was already very clear in the Framework Convention text. And then if we trace back the history of the engagement of Indigenous peoples, at least at the institutional level, this started in 2001, wherein Indigenous peoples organizations were formally recognized as a constituency group in the UNFCCC process. But as you know, as a party-driven process, it is important to have a voice within the formal negotiations and with the formal process, just like what a lot of you have reiterated in your sessions, in your statements. So fast forward 2001, 2015, the same decision that approved the Paris Agreement created the LCIPP, and there was a clear text that says that parties, we all need to recognize that Indigenous knowledge, value systems are actually important to allow us to have holistic approaches in climate change. So that 2015 was a key moment for local communities and Indigenous peoples. And then 3 years later, of the first ever constituted body that puts together parties and Indigenous peoples on equal footing was created by the COP. This was already mentioned by my colleague earlier, and FWG is very unique because it's like a inclusion of key regional groups, but also the 7 sociocultural regions, Indigenous sociocultural regions under the UN system. So it's a microcosm of the world. And you can see parties and Indigenous peoples talking about how they can actually operationalize the mandate of LCIPP, how they can move towards meaningful engagement, full and effective participation, and how they can really shape policies anchored on Indigenous values. 2018, I think one of the COPs where Indigenous peoples really was recognized was in Glasgow. Glasgow really explicitly mentioned that the integration of Indigenous knowledge is crucial for achieving the goal. So this was a pivotal moment for IPs and LCs. And it also prominently recognized the leadership role. So as you can see, there's a transition there from just observers to having a leadership role. And then in 2023, the facilitative working group said, okay, we are tasked to operationalize the platform. We will do this while upholding rights-based approaches. We will do this by ensuring the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous values and worldviews. And we will do this by highlighting the leadership roles of Indigenous peoples and local communities. So using this narrative, the FWG contributed greatly in the shifts in narratives in the global stocktake discussions and the global goal and adaptation discussions, where they highlighted the need to shift from just focusing on the obvious to focusing on a holistic view on the impact of climate change. So we just don't talk about physical impacts, but really also the cultural and the non-economic losses that people actually feel and experience. From short-term thinking to thinking about 7 generations, from priority on economic-centered values to really highlighting our oneness with nature. So these shifts were highlighted in these discussions, and voila, in 2023, we have key decisions in GGA and GST, which really emphasize that parties collectively agree, let's do this, let's move this forward. 2024 is a crucial moment for the LCIPP because we just finished the review of the FWG last June, and parties, based on the draft decision that will hopefully be approved in Baku, they agreed to continue the mandate and the work of the FWG. They agreed to recognize the shifts. They agreed to use indigenous science together with the Western science that we are used to applying. And there's also a move now to even recognize submissions of indigenous peoples like poetry, music, and stories to help feed the process. So these are concrete changes that we are seeing in the process that really emphasize the meaningful engagement of indigenous peoples and local communities and highlighting their leadership roles. So what's next? I will finish with this. I would like to invite everyone in this group. Please engage in the platform. Please reach out to indigenous peoples and in your regions, in your communities to take part. In 2020, from 25 to 27, we will have a new set of FWG members. And right now, selection processes are ongoing in the different regions. We invite you to reach out to the members and take part in the selection process. And so you can be part of the FWG, your voice can be heard and represent the regional groupings of indigenous peoples in the formal constituted body under the UNFCCC. We invite you to engage with us in the different activities. If you will be in Baku, there are a lot of opportunities to take part and contribute in the work plan mandated events. And we will share with you all the links for these events. So you are welcome to join us and also be heard in the process. Ladies and gentlemen, the process is not fast. The process is not instant. But we are seeing steady progress in terms of not just the recognition of indigenous peoples and local communities, but really having a space in the process. And we hope that collectively with this group and other indigenous peoples, we can really move this forward and have that mindset shift and help really achieve transformational climate action. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, and I will end my session here.
Thank you very much, Donna, for that inspiring statement. And we have taken good note of your appeals to promote these rights and their empowerment of the indigenous peoples. Now I give the floor to our last panelist on this panel, Mrs. Iblin Roman Escobar, who is a policy advisor and facilitator for securing indigenous peoples' rights in the Green Economy Coalition. Iblin, you have the floor for about 6 or 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes, is the sound good?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Alin Punchay, thank you for having me here. I am Iblin Roman Escobar, a descent of the Colla people in Bolivia, and I come to you representing, as you mentioned, the Securing Indigenous Peoples' Rights in the Green Economy Coalition, SIRGE. We are a coalition led by indigenous peoples, and we advocate for the indigenous peoples' rights worldwide. First, before I begin really the points I have brought, I would like to make a small note on the presentation of Ms. Donna Mitzi, and that is about the conflation of the use of the terminology local communities and indigenous peoples. The United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples has taken a clear stance against conflating indigenous peoples with local communities or other indigenous groups, and the forum calls for the term to be abolished. And actually, the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights also highlights further that the conflating these groups risks diluting indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, lands, and resources. So I would like to put this note at this conference, please. Now, let's begin by acknowledging today it's the 3rd day of the COP-CBD in Colombia. And the best place to start my real participation, I think, would be with a number. $44 trillion. which is around half of the world's GDP, which is what recent studies say nature contributes to the global economy. But we know this estimate is wrong. Actually, everything we depend on comes from nature. There is no well-being, there is no stable society, there is no future without nature. Nature is the foundation of life itself, as Judge Manuela Ochoa has already put. And as Johan Rockström, leading author of The Planetary Boundaries, said, even if we phase out coal, oil, gas, and we do everything right, we will still fail unless we do right on nature. And that's very important. And indigenous peoples play an essential role in protecting nature. Even though we are only 6% of the global population, indigenous peoples manage about 24% of the Earth's total surface. And we are the stronghold for the remaining biodiversity in our planet. And this is not an accident. Indigenous peoples have been caring for their lands for thousands, as very well explained by Judge Ochoa. But today, indigenous peoples, as all speakers have agreed, face serious threats. And these serious threats come from the climate change itself. We are the front lines, but also, as Ms. Morguera has noted, these threats come from the solutions to fight climate change. The Amazon is a powerful example of what is at the stake. A part of the Brazilian Amazon, probably you know this already, which is one of the richest ecosystem of the planet, has already shifted from being a carbon sink, absorbing carbon, to becoming a carbon source, releasing more carbon that it stores. Science has predicted that the tipping point for the Amazon was between 3 and 5 centigrades global warming, but recent research shows it's not just about temperature, it's about the health of the forest. With deforestation levels reaching 20 to 25%, this tipping point could occur as early as 1,5 centigrades. Right now, we are 1.2 global centigrades of global warming and 17% of deforestation. If this continues, we risk pushing the Amazon beyond recovery already in the coming decades. And this is not about only trees and ecosystems collapsing. This is about a human face. At COP28, an indigenous activist from Minas Gerais in Brazil denounced the burning alive of indigenous activists in Guarani Kaiowá territory just a couple of weeks before the summit. The Amazon, it's really under a lot of pressure of industrial agriculture, but increasingly mining for the energy transition, and indigenous defenders protecting their lands face violence, threats, and many times death, as we have seen. So we call urgently for the strong protection of indigenous human rights and environmental defenders. But this is not limited to the Amazon or the Global South or developing countries. In Norway, Sami peoples, and particularly youth, are struggling to protect their rights against wind projects built on their land without their free, prior, and informed consent. In the Fosen case, for example, youth are now facing legal charges. We see two major threats indigenous peoples confront in the name of climate change solutions. First, is mining for the energy transition, because the world is rushing to move away from fossil fuels to renewables and the demand for critical minerals has skyrocketed. But you have to consider that 54% of the mining projects are on or near indigenous peoples' territories. And that is higher if we consider the indigenous peoples that are not recognized as such. That goes up to 75% in Africa and even 90% in some other parts of the world. Now there is a push for fast tracking.
Evelyn, if I may just interrupt unfortunately, but shortly, if you could wind up in about 1 minute, because we have the third panel that needs to begin. And you can
Yes.
send us your statement. We will include it in the report. Thank you.
Yes, of course. What is important for me is to link the nature and the protection of nature with the fact that indigenous peoples are one of they are key partners in protecting this nature. And to go directly to the recommendations, I should say that indigenous peoples do not oppose development, and that should be clear, that we support the transition, but we demand that this is a just transition, and that the respects of the indigenous peoples are ensured. First, honoring free, prior, and informed consent, respecting indigenous peoples' land rights, ensuring real participation in decision making, providing funding, guaranteeing legal and policy protection for indigenous peoples and their rights, and integrating indigenous science and knowledge in climate action. I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. Well, that brings us to the end of the second panel. But you have a question, please.
Yes, sir. Thanks. The question answered by all the panels. So my question could be asked in all the three panels, but I will ask it in this now. I'm indigenous people. I come from an island where, as a study case, I hear today, I asked the question, but to understand the question, I have to just explain and then I ask the question. It's okay? Well, I'm a study case. I'm at beginning and the end of this whole climate crisis because we are colonized people and we still colonized today. I'm from a Caribbean island, so Caribbean islands are indigenous people, all. And my question is then, why is this discussions going around us, meaning we still colonized, they call us now indigenous people, they call us small island states, but we are still part of a colonization that's still going on. That's why the terminology indigenous, I call it, is a colonial term because I'm not indigenous, I myself. But then the question is why these remaining Caribbean islands where I come from are still colonies is not part of these discussions. We are forgotten. We hear every day, no one should be held behind, human rights for all. But we don't count in this discussion because we're not represented, because we are a colonized territory, we not have representation. Our colonizers, in this case Holland, is speaking for us, is talking about me. Meanwhile, we are disappearing, and they come then and try to help us, that as we are the ones what should help the world, because we island people know everything about survival and nature. That's the only thing they had, and the only thing we have. So I wasn't prepared for this, but I'm here now, and I feel it's all about me and other people like me. So I have a chance to say to all the experts, I hear them very good. They're very good in what they do, but they're missing the real people like us. I'm happy because we, again, discussion point for the world to continue in its economic greed. And I finished like, why they don't call it then waste of economic greed instead of climate justice of baby of colonialism.
Thank you.
Thank you,
sir.
This thing. Thank you.
Thank you. I will just quickly give the floor to one of the panelists to respond very briefly. I'm wondering whether Donna is still tuned in. Thank you. Please unmute. Thank you, Donna. And if you can respond really in 1 minute, because we have to get the next panel going. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. What you mentioned, my dear, is really something that is we hope we can address in the platform. The main mandate of the platform was to have the space an enabling space for both Indigenous peoples and local communities to understand and also have a cordial relationship with and help Indigenous peoples and local communities work with parties and help parties to work with Indigenous peoples and local communities. This is one of the tasks that was given to us by the COP, and we hope that through the work plan and through the initiatives, we'll be able to move this forward. It's not going to happen instantly. And while I'm here, I also want to address the issue on conflation of Indigenous peoples and local communities. When the Conference of the Parties established the LCIPP in 2015, it was mainly because of inclusivity, and because in some countries, Indigenous peoples and local communities are one and the same. In some countries, Indigenous peoples are not, they don't use the term Indigenous peoples, but they use local communities, and you have different variations. And the intention was to bring everyone on board. The issue that you mentioned in terms of the statements from the IPF, the forum, this has been submitted to the SUBSTA and to the Conference of the Parties, and we wait what the parties will say in terms of the naming of the platform, the initiatives. But until then, we will be inviting both Indigenous peoples and local communities in the FWG and in the work of the platform. And we hope that this is something that you can all contribute to, and we look forward to your partnership. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much,
Yes.
Donna, for that response. With that, as I said, we come
One
to the...
question, sir.
Okay, very quick.
Very quick.
Please.
My name is Davika Bisasar. I'm from Bonaire Human Rights Organization, also from Bonaire. And I have a question for anyone who would like to answer it, who's listening on the panelists. We are as an organization for human rights, has been to many of these spaces. We've been to SIDS, we've been to the Summit of the Future, and we are going to COP29. But as civil society, we don't get to speak. We only get to listen. We have no way of having any input on anything. Today is the first time when we went to SIDS and the Summit of the Future. Today, I want to say, is the first time my colleague got an answer from a panelist. We've been to SIDS, they refused to answer our questions. We've been to Summit of the Future, they refused to answer our questions because it has one word that nobody wants to talk about, and that's decolonization. So I just want to know from the panelists, if someone could tell me when we reach the COP29, if we will have a say, and how can we do that? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take quickly, very quickly, just the question.
Thank you so much. The question is, where do we find the balance between development and the indigenous people's rights? Because in Tanzania, we see people, Maasai people, being forced to move out from Ngorongoro Crater, their indigenous home, by the Tanzanian government under the name of environmental protection. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. These are very vast questions. So since I take the advantage of seeing you, Donna, on the screen, so if you want to very quickly respond to both in one minute, it would be great. Thanks.
Yes, thank you again. For the participation, the Conference of the Party, the sessions of the Conference of the Parties is mainly with the governing body. So meaning it has several, it is the highest decision, it's the highest decision-making body of the process. Engagement, if you want to really meaningfully engage, I strongly encourage you to take part in the constituted body discussions. This is where the technical work is happening. So from the constituted body or the work plans, this goes up to the subsidiary bodies, goes up to the Conference of the Parties. At the COP, a lot of things, as I mentioned, it's not a one-off event. The discussions have been continuing. So if you want to really meaningfully engage, please explore the constituted body level and the work plans, because this is where the technical opportunities can really take place. For the balance, it's as I said, it's something that is continuously evolving. The narratives are continuously evolving. The balance right now, the FWG and the LCIPP, push or the priority is to shift the mindset and shift the narratives, and then to really not just about balance, but put nature at the center of the climate policies and discussions. But I said it's not going to happen. So we find little steps. We do things strategically with other work streams and with other partners, and are very hopeful that things can have these key moments as we are now talking about transformational climate action. So all hands on deck and all brains on deck. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed, Donna. With that, we certainly conclude this panel, and we open the third panel on small island states, an extremely important panel also, like the two others, because they're in a critical situation. And I invite I'm glad to note that all the panelists on this panel are here in person, which is great. So please come on board, and we can begin the panel. So we begin this panel, and we are very, very pleased to have His Excellency Matthew Wilson, who's the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Barbados to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva, with over 25 years of experience in trade and development, and very much in the forefront of sustainable development, gender equality, and leadership roles at WTO and in UN bodies. And before I give him the floor, I would simply like to begin this panel with a quote from the Prime Minister of St. Kitts and Nevis at the general debate. It was on 27th of September, Terence Michael Drew, who said, because it's a very eloquent and poignant quote, "We are small islands. We are small, yes, but our voices carry the weight of rising seas, thundering storms, and livelihoods teetering on the edge of erasure." You have the floor, Matthew.
Thank you very much. I'm a little disappointed you didn't quote my Prime Minister, Mia Mottley. She's extremely quotable. No, but thank you so much for kind of placing the spotlight on small island developing states here today. To be honest, never have our issues been more existential, more visceral, and more pressing. Now, I note that the discussion questions for this panel are focused on how SIDS can interact and benefit from global litigation around climate justice, et cetera. I'm going to let my other colleagues handle that, because I think although the legal aspect of climate justice is important, frankly, those of us that live in small island developing states, we cannot wait for judgments. We cannot wait for court-led recourse. And frankly, some of us, we do not have the finance to be able to engage at that level for extended periods of time. So this is not to undermine the importance of this route to advocacy and action, as mentioned by Lolita in the youth panel, as it challenges the system. And we need to do that, but I want to focus on a different angle. I want to quote High Commissioner Volker Turk, who said that small islands bear a climate crisis they did not create and cannot address alone. I mean, you heard this morning. We contribute less than 1% of global emissions, yet we are so disproportionately affected by the climate crisis. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events. I see this myself every time I go home. And just a few months ago, we had the fastest ever forming Category 5 hurricane in history in the Caribbean region, which led to widespread destruction. I could speak about the overheating oceans that Barbados is facing. I'm sure Bonaire is facing it as well. Bleaching corals, threats to freshwater reserves, droughts 1 minute, floods another minute, food insecurity, I could go on. So climate justice, though, is not just a matter of environmental protection, adaptation, and mitigation. It is, as you heard this morning, about people and about communities. It's about the fundamental human right to life and dignity. exactly what was said by Todd and Adele this morning. And this is why I'm really pleased that one of the first priorities of the first regional office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in the Caribbean will have climate justice as one of its main pillars. And I hope that it will help provide us countries in the Caribbean with the tools to better ensure human rights language is reflected in COP outcomes. And slight parenthesis to my colleague from Bonaire, I hope that you are able to use this regional office in the Caribbean for human rights as a vector for your priorities. And I would also suggest, and I'm not going to get into the decolonization part of it, but I would also really suggest that you as Indigenous communities in Bonaire link up with the other Indigenous communities in the Caribbean, such as in Dominica, for example. And I'm happy to create that interface if you need afterwards, because I very much understand your priorities and your perspective. All right, so for me, discussing climate justice without accounting for climate finance is a bit like drawing a map with disappearing ink. And this is why the Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, launched by my Prime Minister, Mia Mottley, is so incredibly important. It calls for more resilient global financial frameworks to help developing countries, especially SIDS and lower and middle income countries, to address the climate crisis through effective access to multiple avenues of finance. It calls for reform of the debt sustainability. It calls for more empowerment of small island developing states to be able to invest in green technologies and climate adaptation efforts and disaster preparedness without falling further into debt. Because one of the most ridiculous statistics I can tell you about today is that most small island developing states and lower and middle income countries are actually paying back more in debt than we're investing in climate adaptation, than we're investing in health, that we're investing in labor, that we're investing in human rights. That cannot be right in 2024. So we've had a number of really significant milestones under the Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, including the Loss and Damage Fund, and including the fact that multilateral development banks, including the World Bank, now include a disaster clause in their loan agreements, which means if you face a natural disaster, you do not have to repay right away. You can take some time, pause, and build back. And this is incredible. So I really urge you to learn more about the Bridgetown Initiative, and I really do call on the youth in the room and online to join what I think is a movement. And part of that is to mirror what, again, Adele said this morning, which is how can developing countries, where the majority of the critical minerals for the green transition are located, be leaders in developing new green technologies and know-how? How can we ensure that we, as developing countries, are able to export those technologies and knowledge rather than just exporting raw materials and minerals? And for me, this is a key issue that we have to grapple with. So COP29, the Finance Summit, let's see what happens just around the corner. And we need to use it to advocate for increased climate finance, including a more equitable resource distribution from the multilateral development banks, and also new sources of finance. Because let's be honest, the capital markets that we thought were going to deliver automatic finance for the green transition have not worked the way that we thought they would. The private sector has not stepped up in the way that we thought they should. Philanthropy has spoken beautiful words, but they have not stepped up in the way that they should. So we also need to put some collective pressure on these different arms as well to be able to do what they should be able to do and have the means to be able to do for climate finance and climate adaptation. So this whole notion of accessibility is really key because liquidity is there, the money is there. But if the money is there and small island developing states and small communities cannot access the funds, it doesn't make sense. So accessibility for me has to be a really important part. Let me go to my final point, which is on trade. I spend a lot of my time up here on trade issues and a lot of time also trying to convince people that trade is not the enemy, that trade and trade policy can actually be a really powerful solution to support transparency, interoperability, and predictability around policies to support a green and just transition. From addressing fossil fuel subsidies, and let's also be clear, open another parenthesis, a lot of the green transition that we're looking at, you heard it this morning on EV, will come still from fossil fuels, will come from critical minerals. So we have to be very, very careful to look at the balance and to make sure that when we say we are investing in green technology, that we're actually not making the situation worse. Trade can help us better identify and trade in environmental goods and services. It can help us deal with plastics pollution. Barbados is one of the leaders of the plastics pollution dialogue at the WTO. And it can also help us develop global public goods like carbon border measurements for developing countries. We all know what the EU is doing right now in CBAM. We know what the US is doing. Brazil is coming afterwards. UK is doing the same thing. Small countries like mine, we do not have the mechanics, the mechanisms, the methodologies to be able to measure carbon border adjustments and carbon capture ourselves. So I'm really happy that the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF are working on what I consider to be a global public good to help all of us be able to do this. So finally, my advice is that the time for talk really should be coming to an end. To quote my Prime Minister at COP26 in Glasgow, when will leaders lead? And frankly, for me, we need to really depoliticize the discussions around environmental sustainability and climate matters. It's too much politics and not enough action. My niece is 11 years old, and she is, in her own way, a climate advocate. And I have to say, I grapple with explaining to her why we are negotiating if and how to save the earth. She doesn't understand the concept of negotiating to save a generation or negotiating to save the earth. So I think sometimes we may need to go back to these very simple but profound questions, and maybe that will help us approach this existential situation a little bit more intelligently. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for those very insightful remarks and drawing your attention to the Bridgetown Initiative, which I think we should all also get into to get to know better. And Matthew is also a friend of the Geneva Centre, so on that note too, thank you very much. With that, I will give the floor to our next panelist, because he has to leave afterwards, Igor Grishko, who is the focal point for climate change at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Igor, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Great day, colleagues. And let me start with actually thank you to the Geneva Centre for Human Rights Advancement and Global Dialogue for this initiative. And also thank you, the previous speaker, His Excellency Wilson, for actually quoting our High Commissioner. And just to also that my 10-year-old daughter, she's asking pretty much the same questions. Why? Just to immediately respond to your comment about our new regional office in Caribbean and the strategy and the priorities on climate change, this is also relevant for the entire United Nations Human Rights Office. The environmental degradation and climate change is one of 4 our strategic directions for next year, several years. Just let me continue with my statement today. Small island states are at the front line of climate change, as has been already stated today several times. They face rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and significant environmental degradation. Despite their vulnerabilities, small island states often encounter multiple challenges in bringing climate justice action. This includes limited resources, including financial resources, and the political leverage to challenge the stand of historical polluters, whose development was achieved through industrialization and colonization, and who are responsible for the most of carbon emissions. Despite these challenges, small island states have found new pathways for justice. For example, the recent International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea ruling that classifies greenhouse gas emissions as marine pollution is a significant achievement, and several panelists today spoke about it. This ruling provides a new legal avenue for small island states to hold major polluters accountable, but the issue remains is actually the enforcement of that ruling. International courts play a critical role in defining and clarifying states' obligations under international law. While advisory opinions, such as the one pending from ICJ, are not binding, they have significant influence by providing legal clarity and establishing precedents that can guide future litigation. Courts can help ensure that states comply with their legal obligations and reduce emissions and protect vulnerable populations. The ICJ's forthcoming opinion will be critical for small islands, as it will define the legal consequences of inaction on climate change. But I very much agree with your point that there is no time actually to wait for those rulings. As my chief thought to say today during the high-level segment, the Secretary General of the United Nations called for exploring application of transitional justice lens as a part of human rights and equity-based approach to addressing loss and damage. Such approach, as also our High Commissioner recently stated, could include, for example, International Commission of Inquiry to investigate the causes of environmental damage. We believe that such an approach could assist small states in bringing forward the climate justice action. Our office was one of those United Nations institutions provided written observations with written comments with regards to the request for advisory opinion to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights recently. United Nations, civil society, NGOs should continue such practice to support small island states before international judicial systems. Small island states can use the human rights-based approach applied in Klima Sirioninen versus Switzerland case to argue that climate inaction by major emitting countries constitutes a violation of the right to life and right to private and family life. By framing climate change as a human rights issue, small island states can push for greater accountability from polluters whose emissions disproportionately impact populations in vulnerable situations. While that ruling applies to Switzerland, small island states can promote the global applicability of the court's findings by emphasizing the universal nature of human rights obligations. The recognition that climate inaction violates fundamental human rights is not limited to Europe, but can serve as a universal principle that small island states can invoke in their claims against major polluters in different international forums. When it comes to COP29, one of the key negotiating priorities there is the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. To meet the growing needs for adaptation finance and addressing loss and damage, including for small island states, this new goal should adopt a people-centered and human rights-based approach guided by principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, as well as equity. We all need to put collective efforts to ensure that the obligations to mobilize adequate resources for climate action is addressed as a matter of human rights obligations. As under core human rights treaties, states acting individually and collectively are obliged to mobilize and allocate the maximum available resources to progressive realization of human rights. Financing for addressing loss and damage, which has long been ignored by developed countries, should be an integral part of a new finance goal in order for it to be adequately supportive for the full scope of actions needed to address climate change and its impact. Regarding social acceptability of climate measures, let me please again refer to my chief of branch, Todd, who mentioned today the need for just transition, which centered in human rights. While just transition has become a buzzword, we will be surprised how little consensus there is around the definition beyond the parameters of the International Labour Organization. Many developed countries understand that we must transition now, while developing countries understand that they first need the means to reach the level of development to be able to transition for more sustainable economies. On the other hand, there is a noticeable trend of youth from small island states migrating to developed countries. Some islands have experienced a population decline of up of 1/3 over the past decade. When it's the positive that the individuals can seek opportunities abroad, this migration has led to significant population reduction with implications for human rights and their home countries, particularly regarding the preservation of cultural rights and identity, the right to health, the right to clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. A just transition would help promote opportunities, decent work, and the realization of the right to development, as well as right to healthy environment and cultural preservation for small island states. I will conclude at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Igor. With that, I pass on the floor to our third panelist, the lady on the panel, Mrs. Vanessa Schulz, who is a program analyst for disaster risk reduction and recovery within the Building Resilience team at UNDP. She works to enhance community resilience against disasters, focusing on integrating sustainable practices and recovery strategies in vulnerable regions. Vanessa, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for convening this conference and this panel on small island states. And I would also like to focus not so much on the legal processes and the litigation questions, but rather focusing on how, in order to ensure the protection of people's rights and upholding of human rights standards, as well as justice, remedy, and redress for those communities and countries most affected by climate change and extreme weather events, which include small island states, it is crucial to strengthen their skills and means to adapt, prepare for, and respond to these impacts, including through loss and damage, through disaster preparedness for response and recovery. Remedy for injustice includes prevention, mitigation, and response to climate change and disasters. And we can also see that SIDS are increasingly requesting support in these areas of work. Therefore, strengthening the capacities of affected countries and communities for resilience building and disaster risk reduction is one important element for small island states to access climate justice. So how does UNDP work with and in small island states? UNDP is present in over 170 countries, where we work with national and local governments and communities to accelerate sustainable, inclusive, and just development that leaves no one behind. UNDP has had a long-standing programmatic footprint in 39 SIDS for several decades, making it the largest agency on the ground. And this allows us to really observe the direct impact of climate change and disasters on the communities. And we can see that the scale and scope of extreme weather events is increasingly detrimental for people and livelihoods, with less time to predict and prepare for, which then again is impeding timely response and recovery efforts. And based on this experience, one key pillar of UNDP's support to small island states is building disaster and climate resilience with climate and broader environmental justice and inclusion as underlying key principles in 4 programmatic areas. First, integrated risk governance and institutional capacity building. Second, disaster and climate risk information and data. Third, sustainable recovery to build back better from fast and slow onset disasters. And finally, early warning, preparedness, and anticipation, enabling early action. In the work, UNDP mainstreams a participatory, inclusive, and rights-based approach and ensures that communities contribute to risk-informed decision-making based on local experiences and needs. From risk governance mechanisms and policies to the establishment of inclusive early warning systems, and also as key actors of disaster response and recovery. And by providing this support and ensuring access and meaningful participation in all phases of the disaster cycle, UNDP strengthens SIDS and their communities to access climate justice. And to make it a bit more concrete, I would like to share with you 2 examples on how UNDP works on the ground. One of them being in the Pacific region, where UNDP creates spaces for developing and implementing progressive and tailored governance shifts towards more resilient development. And by working through national and local institutions and nurturing, sharing, and learning, UNDP promotes Pacific-led and determined risk governance and strengthens capacities for climate and disaster mitigation, preparedness, and response, protecting lives and livelihoods. Gender equality, disability, and social inclusion are also placed at the center of these interventions, ensuring equal, meaningful participation in decision-making and joint identification of local priorities for resilient development that address the needs and safeguard the rights of communities contributing to climate justice for the affected populations. A second example is in Dominica and Guyana, where UNDP strengthens the disaster management capacity of women who are often most affected by and the first responders during disasters. By providing training on disaster risk management, UNDP scales up the resilience of small farmers, women farmer groups, and indigenous people while improving the sustainability of their livelihoods and assets. The project demonstrates how building resilience and response capacity of women farmers advances access to climate justice by providing the means and skills to adapt and respond to extreme weather events. Besides the programmatic support to SIDS, UNDP also actively supports key issues of climate justice in global political processes. For example, as part of the interim secretariat for the new fund for responding to loss and damage, UNDP is supporting the initial setup of the fund to be fit for purpose and to also ensure accessibility to the most vulnerable, particularly SIDS, who have been champions for the issue of loss and damage in climate negotiations. So to conclude, by working with SIDS governments and communities and strengthening their resilience and capacities to prepare for and respond to climate change and disaster impacts, and addressing loss and damage, UNDP drives transformational change and advances climate and intergenerational justice, inclusion, participation, and the full enjoyment of human rights. Preparedness for response and recovery is an important part of climate justice as it strengthens the capacities to address and respond to climate change and disasters. And the prominence of loss and damage in the climate justice and human rights discussion is an important development, and it is key to broaden the scope and also include long-term resilience building and disaster risk reduction, including preparedness, recovery, and response in future conversations. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Vanessa. With that, I pass on the floor to our final speaker on this panel and of the conference, Mr. Sébastien Duic, who is a senior attorney at the Center for International Environmental Law, CIEL, in Geneva, where he specializes in environmental law and human rights. He has extensive experience in advocacy and legal research, and he focuses on advancing legal frameworks that promote sustainable development and environmental justice. With that, Sébastien, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it is an honor to close this panel. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation and all of you for your participation. Much has already been covered, so I'll try to go over some key points. But I wanted actually to start from the perspective that was shared by the ambassador in relation to actually the question on regarding what is the role of negotiation in 2024 when we have been trying to deal with this issue for decades, and how can we defend actually the relevance of those to people outside of those halls that are really wondering what are we doing with all the time invested there. And I think the important role for us here in Geneva for human rights actors is really to use every legal tool at our disposal to actually address those challenges and actually build upon the legal frameworks that we have that could help us if only we considered climate change as an issue that should be addressed through legal principles, legal norms, legal obligations, and not something where actually everything is up for negotiations again. I am clearly not speaking from a small island perspective, but I really wanted to acknowledge the important role that small island states and their diplomatic team have played across the past decades to actually help us get to the point where we are, where there is a lot of despair, but we have done a lot of progress still. And this is to a large extent thanks to many of the small island developing states in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian Oceans, who have really moved forward this agenda. I have a long list of examples I could provide, but in the interest of time, I'll let you come to me if you would like some examples. But we've witnessed this leadership time and again. One critical opportunity that we have just ahead of us, in particular because expectations on COP29 and other upcoming conferences of the UNFC are extremely low, unfortunately, building on our previous experiences of those conferences, is the advisory opinion processes that small island states have triggered at the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea and the International Court of Justice. It is a fundamental, critical, historic opportunity for states actually to work with the courts, and many have done that, to clarify what are the existing legal obligations of states, what are the legal foundations for international cooperation when it comes to climate change. And the questions are grounded on human rights obligations. And so from the 2nd to the 13th of December, as states present their oral arguments to the court, we really call upon all states to support actually small island developing states in their demands for a strong advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice that will clarify, hopefully once and for all, actually the fact that legal norms that have been established over the past decades in relation to the responsibility of states, the importance of providing remedy for harms really can be upheld in the context of climate change. This brings me to my second point. Loss and damage was already discussed, so I will not get into too much details, but it's critical to acknowledge the fact that loss and damage are happening. Climate loss and damages are happening because political and economic decisions makers did not act upon the information, the scientific information that they had at their disposal, when they still had the time to prevent foreseeable harms. And so as a consequence of this, we need to go back to legal principles and ensure that we actually provide, through institutions already established like the loss and damage fund, but also through other mechanisms, an actual remedy, because we know in law that for every right there must be a remedy. And this is something that small island states and other states that are most impacted, as well as communities at the front line of climate harms, are lacking at the moment. So we call upon states to uphold their legal obligations, to provide remedy and reparations for climate harms, including with regards to the regulation of the private actors who have knowingly contributed to climate chaos. We also know, my third point, that we will not get out of this discussion unless we actually tackle the one main sector of the economy that is responsible for over 80% of greenhouse gases, that is the fossil fuel-based economy. We will not be able to address loss and damage and the escalating harms on communities unless we can actually get states to act upon the urgent need to phase out fossil fuels in a manner that is fair and funded. We cannot expect that those countries that have contributed least to the climate crisis will be required to act without the additional support that is actually established in international law, including in the context of a UN Framework Convention on climate change. We need this fossil fuel phase out to be fast. The science is unforgiving about the consequences for us to procrastinate and continue to add delays to the importance to phase out fossil fuels. And we need this phase out of fossil fuel to be effective and full, to tackle all forms of fossil fuel related emissions so that we can actually deliver on the goals of the Paris Agreement, on the obligations of states with regard to those that are most impacted by foreseeable harms. To come back to two final points, public participation is essential. Unfortunately, we do not have many representatives from civil society in small island developing states with us today, but we know that, and the IPCC actually noted, that civil society is to a great extent the only reliable motor for driving institutions to change at the pace required. If we do not have civil society voices in the negotiating halls, we will continue to see processes that fail to deliver actual results that really drive change on the ground and contribute to climate justice. And so we need to make sure that those voices of those most impacted can be actually invited and heard effectively in the negotiating halls. We have heard some great examples of recent progress in relation to, for instance, the Indigenous Peoples platform at the UNFCCC, but we need to see more of those initiatives and effective participation. In particular, we also need to see United Nations and governments to ensure the safety of all participants to climate conferences. When climate conferences take place in states where actually human rights and environmental advocates are jailed because of an engagement for climate justice, we cannot expect a safe, legitimate, and credible outcome from those conferences. We also know that effective participation of the public requires not just enabling the voices of those most impacted, but also preventing the capture of decision-making processes by corporate actors. And so in that context, I really would like to point to the experience of many UN bodies, including the World Health Organization, in regulating the activities of the private sector to ensure that decision-making can really be targeted at the needs of people's communities and states, and not at the interest of economic actors. We must see conflict of interest policies and norms to prevent corporate capture. And finally, I just wanted to conclude, because we've mentioned the Summit of the Future a few times today, the fact that climate change is to a great extent the most significant threat to the universalism of human rights today, but also to the enjoyment of the human rights of future generations. And the short-termism lens or bias that we have applied as human rights community also failing to fully embrace what intergenerational justice requires us to do is something that we absolutely have a responsibility as human rights actors to challenge and to reconsider. In that context, there are a lot of recent developments re-questioning the importance of upholding states' obligation for present generation, including in the context of intra-generational equity, but also towards future generations. And so we are encouraged by this, but we believe that embracing the history, like the existence of states' obligations towards future generation and the need to protect the rights of future generation is an essential path for us to achieve climate justice. And this is not only true for communities that are in states most impacted by climate change, but also some courts, even in Europe, have highlighted the fact that indeed states have to take into account the rights of future generation as they establish climate policies. I'll just conclude with 3 sentences on key messages for COP29. The first one is, again, the need to guarantee free speech and safe participation for all participants, including because the COP is hosted in a country that has failed to uphold its obligation with regard to civil and political rights, including in the lead up to the COP29. We absolutely need to see progress on the delivery of climate finance at this COP. Climate finance is a key agenda of this conference, and we must see developed countries and countries historically responsible for the climate crisis to really uphold their legal obligations towards other states. And finally, we must see action to accelerate the decarbonization of our economy and the shift away from fossil fuel, and we must stop the adoption of new mechanisms, new tools that actually continue to allow polluting industry to operate on a business as usual model, including through, for instance, carbon markets that scientific research have demonstrated are not contributed to effective climate action. Thank you again, and I really look forward to continuing to engage with those who carries the greatest message of urgency so that as Geneva, as UN institutions, as human rights practitioners, we really take more responsibility in making sure that our work, our advocacy is actually aligned with this extremely urgent need for us to uphold obligations in the context of the climate crisis.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And actually, that was a very fitting statement made at the very end of the conference. So that spares me the trouble of, not the trouble, the time of going through 2 or 3 panels that I had prepared. So thank you again. And we all really hope that COP29 will live up to its promise that we all have in it and not remain deadlift. With that, on behalf of the Geneva Centre and on my personal behalf as its Executive Director, I would wish to thank, firstly, all the speakers and panelists on the high-level segment and on the 3 panels, including yourselves on this last panel, for their interest, for their presence, for their interventions, and commitment to the cause. And as I had already mentioned before, we will shortly be putting out in the coming weeks a full report on the outcome of the conference with the think piece, which we always name Lessons Learned and Ways Forward, which contains recommendations, takeaways, we build upon that. And this will be sent individually to all the panelists and the speakers, but will naturally be put on our website and announced on our social media platforms with a link. So it will be available to everybody. And with that, I think we can close this conference. And I invite all of you here to have some refreshments, which are ready on the table behind you. Thank you again.